I think one of the most powerful things it gives people is awareness. Because everyone wants to jump from awareness to what do I do now? And I think we underestimate just how powerful that first step is.
Yeah.
Just to be, that's why I behaved like that. Oh, I had no idea. I guess we're blind until we're not. We're unaware until we're not. And then we can't unsee what we see.
Exactly.
And I really feel your work beautifully helps people see patterns in their life that they weren't previously aware of. And there are multiple ways that they can then go and move forward through that. But I think that's very, very powerful. In terms of patterns, you write in this book about personality.
Yeah.
And there's a very powerful section where you talk about the association between certain personality types and disease. And in particular, I like that section where you mentioned William Osler, and he was talking about the type of people who he observed getting angina.
Yeah.
And you contrasted that with this kind of type C personality, which is associated with all kinds of other chronic conditions. I wonder if you could speak to those things a little bit.
Sure. So again, these are the things that nobody teaches you in medical school. But as I advanced in my experience in family practice and also did 7 years of palliative care work, I began to notice that who developed chronic illness and who didn't wasn't accidental. That the people that develop chronic illness, by that I mean autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, scleroderma, lupus, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, inflammatory bowel disease, chronic asthma, et cetera, these people have certain personality patterns that I kept noticing over and over and again. And especially in palliative care, when people are dying of chronic illness, often malignancy, I would see these patterns. And what were they? So there were automatic concern for the emotional needs of others while suppressing your own. Exemplified by a woman who, this is a true story, she's diagnosed with breast cancer. Her husband's first wife died of breast cancer. Another doctor tells her she's got it. And her first response is, but I'm worried about my husband. How will I support him? Now, she's the one that's going to have to go through chemotherapy, radiation, and possibly surgery or whatever. How will I support my husband? So this automatic concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. That's a salient characteristic of people who develop chronic illness. Secondly, a rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility. Is in the case of when I was writing the book, and I was rigidly identified with the book, and my blood pressure was going up.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't thinking of myself, Number 3, repression of healthy anger. That's a major one. Healthy anger is one of my healing principles, and it's essential. Healthy anger is simply a boundary defense that says, no, you're in my space, get out. That's what healthy anger is. It does its job, it's gone. But without that boundary defense, you get trampled on all the time. And these really so-called really nice people who never get angry, they're the ones who develop malignancy and autoimmune disease. And the fourth characteristic is 2 fatal beliefs. And I say fatal beliefs, potentially fatal. One is that you're responsible for what other people feel, and the other is that you must never disappoint anybody. Now, how these traits predispose, I don't say they cause the disease. I don't deal in causes. It's simplistic to talk about single causes. But they contribute to the onset significantly. And people with chronic illness invariably have them.
Yeah.
I never find otherwise. These are not, nobody's born with these traits. I mean, have you ever met a one-day-old baby that doesn't know how to say no? Try and feed them something they don't want to eat, These are personality traits that we develop to fit in with our environment.
Yeah.
And if their environment is, if your parents are alcoholics, you're going to end up as a caretaker. As a 4 or 5-year-old, you're going to be an emotional caretaker by suppressing your own needs. Now, that's going to show up in illness of mind or body later on in life. And for all kinds of physiological reasons, mostly because it invites all kinds of stress. You're creating all kinds of stress for yourself. which then has all kinds of physiological impacts. So these character traits are in contrast with but they're not who the person really is.
It's who they became.
It's who they became as an adaptation to their environment. Then the body says no. The body rebels and says, no, this is not good for you. But the question is, are people going to learn from their disease or not? And a lot of people, whether through help or whether through some intuition or some grace, if they learn to look at their diseases not just as something to get rid of, but also as a teacher of where in my life was I not being myself. Now, I don't recommend disease as a way of learning, and I'm not saying people shouldn't do whatever they can to get treatment and to heal in other ways, but at the same time, if they open that inquiry of what is this disease here to teach me about me, they're going to find that these patterns were present and they don't need to be. Because they're no longer the children that are constrained to be that way.
It's not either or. It's not either it's emotional or it's physical.
No, it's
these things are complex. And, you know, disease as a teacher, wow. I mean, I completely agree with you. That is something that many people may find triggering. The medical profession, certainly, in my experience of it, the Western medical profession doesn't really acknowledge that side of things. Disease is that discrete entity. Now you have it. We've got the proof. Now we need to treat it. Without an understanding, you know, it's the biomedical model, not the social model, right? Spiritual, I mean, what role does spirituality play in modern medicine at the moment? Very little for me. And I think it's very important. You know, you explain that there with compassion. It is such a tricky area, I found, to communicate with people, because a lot of people who are that way inclined feel this as blame. You know, I've made myself get sick. What are you saying, Dr. Maté? Are you saying that my personality has caused my illness? And let's just sort of expand on that a little bit in case anyone is thinking like that.
Well, it's a really essential question. I would say yes, aspects of your personality contributed to the onset of your illness. Again, I don't use cause because there's so many different aspects to causation. But yes, aspects of it. But the reason it's important to pay attention to that is because if I could tell you that aspects of your personality, ways of being, contributed to illness, I'm also telling you that if you were to transform those, you could actually affect your illness in a very positive way. Now, that's the first thing. The second thing is, I would say, is it's not your fault. You didn't choose to suppress yourself. Those were adaptations to your environment. You didn't choose to put other people's needs ahead of your own, chronically and pathologically. That was your response to the environment. Why would I blame you for an unconscious adaptation that you developed when you were 2 years old and didn't know any better? So there's absolutely no blame in this perspective whatsoever, absolutely none. And it's inappropriate to even think of blame. But do people perceive it that way? Yeah, they can. But I would say to them, look, what would you rather have? What would you rather be told? That you're simply a physical object in the hands of your physicians with no agency whatsoever? I mean, when you talk about your principles of healing in your book, control is one of them. And I hadn't read your book when I wrote mine, and you hadn't read mine when you wrote yours. But I talk about the same dynamic. I call it agency. You call it control. But it's the same thing. Would you rather be an object in the hands of your physicians? Would you have some agency? Would you rather be actually involved and to learn how aspects of your life that you developed as a helpless young child are no longer serving you? And if you alter them. Now, in that chapter called Diseases Teacher, I quote two American researchers, absolutely credentialed. One of them is a physician at Harvard, Dr. Jeff Rediger. Have you had Jeff?
No, I want to. We went to schedule it, then he couldn't travel, and I just haven't got around to it. But I really want to. Maybe this will be a nice impetus for me to recontact him.
So Jeff wrote a book called Cured,
yeah.
About what they call spontaneous healing. These are people that are given terminal diagnosis.
Yeah.
By the way, here in Britain, there's a wonderful example of it. Stephen Hawking, who was diagnosed with ALS at age 20, he was given 2 years to live. And he became one of the world's great physicians and writers, and lived till deep into his 70s. Maybe we don't know everything as physicians. Is that possible that we don't? But in any case, Jeff Rediger is a director of a hospital unit at Harvard, at McLean's Hospital in Massachusetts. He's also a doctor of divinity and a psychiatrist and a physician. And in this book, he researched people with so-called spontaneous healing. These are people that have been written off by the medical profession as terminally ill, death sentences, either because medical treatment had failed or because they had refused them. And they got better anyway and lived decades longer. And so Jeff says, well, what happened here? Another American researcher, oncological psychologist, Kelly Turner, wrote a book called Radical Remission. Same thing. I've done the same kind of research myself. What all three of us have found is that whatever else people did, these healings were not spontaneous. Didn't just happen.
No.
These people have changed their lives. They took supplements. They did yoga. They meditated. They went into nature. They got counseling. Whatever they did, but the biggest change was in their relationship to themselves. Yeah. And now I'm not saying we have a cure-all for everybody, but I'm saying that if these dramatic examples exist, what if we applied that all across the whole range of medicine? What if everybody with chronic illness, this question was raised, well, what is your relationship to yourself? And what extent are you being authentic? And you know what? This may sound surprising, and I don't recommend it. But even when I was working in palliative care, I had the occasional patient say to me, Doc, this cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. They're saying this a week or two before they died. Why? Because I learned so much about myself that otherwise I never would have found out. It's made my whole life worthwhile. Again, people, I'm not recommending cancer as a way of waking up. All I'm saying is, even that experience, we can use it to learn something about ourselves from.
I mean, that chapter is so powerful. I know a friend of a friend who's no longer with us. He at a young age was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And before that, he was super active, captain of a sports team, super active. I was in a wheelchair for many years. And I got to know him only for about 3 years or so. And I remember the last time I spoke to him, we'd communicate on WhatsApp. It was really funny because he would really enjoy listening to the podcast, and he'd send me messages on what he'd learned or what he was thinking. And he said once, I've never felt this happy and content. And at that time, he couldn't communicate with his voice. It could only be via words. All his needs were taken care of by a carer. He was in a wheelchair to move around. Previously very sporty, very active. And I thought, wow, never felt this happy and content. And again, you speak to what Jeff was saying, what you write about this in that chapter, yes, one of my core values is curiosity. I think every physician should have that as one of their core values, because what do we often do in medicine with these healings or these things we can't explain? We kind of pretend they're not happening. We can't explain them in our reductionist model, so they're not real. I don't know, maybe the patient's lying. It's often what people think, which is ridiculous. It's like, well, isn't that interesting that we don't know? Like, I love learning things that I don't know. Go, wow, what is going on there?
But to interrupt for a moment, for curiosity, you have to let go of something.
Ego.
You have to let go of the ego that I know.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, physicians, it's not that they think they know everything, but they think that what they don't know is not worth knowing.
Exactly. And also it goes into how you talk about culture, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people who end up in medicine simply went into medicine because they were good at school, at academic subjects. That is so common. They often weren't drawn to healing. It was just like, I'm good at school. I want to do a good job that pays decent money and gives me security. And I understand why people make those decisions. I really do. But the truth is that at some point in your career, if you didn't go in for the right reasons, you don't actually figure some of that stuff out, you're going to be having quite an unhappy, discontented life, which is going to impact the way that you look after your patients.
Absolutely.
But this kind of emotional stress within our minds, the way we view ourselves, it is always, in my experience, a missing piece that unless we look at, we have a limit on our recovery. There's a patient I wrote about in Happy Mind, Happy Life, who this 48-year-old lady who she had upper abdominal pain, she had bloating, she had bilateral upper arm pains, and she'd been to see a variety of physicians. She wasn't getting much better. The medications weren't helping. She then was reading things online. She was empowering herself. She made changes to her lifestyle. She changed her diets.
Yeah.
She would move more regularly. She would prioritize her sleep and stress reduction. And there was some improvement, but there was still a ceiling. There was still these symptoms afflicting everywhere. And when she came to me, I remember thinking, what are we missing here? What are we missing? Her life, a lot of these choices now in her life look pretty great. What's going on here? And as I inquired, as I compassionately inquired, right, it became very clear. She said something. This is when I knew, oh, here we go. She said, Doc, I always end up in relationships with older men. They're usually married. Yeah. And they always treat me really badly.
That's right.
And as we sort of together inquired, we obviously all roots went back to her childhood, and she perceived as a child that her older sister got more attention than her from her parents. And it was incredible because even as she was saying it, you could see the light bulb moment in her own head. This wasn't physician healing the patient. This was, me just simply being a guide to help her find her own truth. And as she came to terms with that, as she did a variety of things to help process that, honestly, right, 6 months later, she ends up in a relationship with a man her own age who treated her really well. 3 months later, all her symptoms had gone, and they haven't come back since.
Wow.
Right? This is real. Like, emotional stress is real.
Which is what you would expect if you understood the science.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not something we're taught. Yeah. And also something you said, Gabor, I think is really powerful, this idea of agency.
Yeah.
You say, what would you prefer? I mean, not to share with you what the science is? You just keep going in this disempowering model? No. Or explain. And that's something, I mentioned competitiveness before.
Yeah.
Competitiveness is, if you'd ask any of my friends, they'd say Ron is really competitive. He won't lose. They're right. I wouldn't lose. I would not. I would do anything I needed to do to not lose. But it wasn't because I enjoyed winning. It's because it was too painful. Loss was too painful for me. But now, hand on heart, I'm not competitive. So it wasn't my personality. It was a behavioral adaptation. And I no longer need that behavioral adaptation. And I think people don't get that. They think the personality, who they are now, is who they have to remain.
Well, let me just, I phrase that a little bit differently. I mean, the concept we totally agree on. I would say it was your personality, but your personality wasn't who you were.
Yeah.
In other words, the personality is an amalgam of genuine aspects of ourselves with these adaptations.
Yeah.
And what we can actually do is to purify the personality so that there's no distinction between ourselves and there's no contradiction between ourselves and our personality. So certain personality traits are not us at all. They're simply who we learn to be in order to get through.
And we can unlearn them.
We can absolutely unlearn them. And sometimes, of course, illness comes along. Just, again, if somebody got sick, I'd never go to them and say, listen, congratulations, this is a great wake-up call, learn from it. I would never say that to anybody. Because that's, people have to come to that realization themselves. But I would ask them, have you considered the possibility that, along with the physical treatments we're going to give you, have you considered the possibility that there may be aspects of your life that have contributed to the onset of this condition that'd be worth investigating so that you can become empowered to do something about them? And I want to go back to something you said earlier about the 10-minute visit. That needn't be a barrier.
Yeah.
Because the barrier is not the 10 minutes. The barrier is the lack of awareness of the physician. Because even in 10 minutes, you can say to a person, there's some considerable evidence that your rheumatoid arthritis, that your lupus, that your multiple sclerosis, that your inflamed bowel is related to emotional factors. Is that something you'd be willing to explore in addition to whatever treatment I'm going to give you? Are you willing to talk to somebody? I'm not expert to talk about that. I wasn't trained to do that, but I'm aware of those relationships. Are you willing to talk to somebody? So the physician doesn't have to do it all.
Yeah.
The physician just has to be aware of it. That's all. And let me just say one thing, something else that occurs to me that's really important to say here. It's not exactly apropos, but it does come up for me. This is not just individual; it's also social. If you look at here in Britain, who was more prone to develop COVID? It wasn't just. They say that we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together. No, we weren't. People that were black or immigrants of color, they were at much higher risk. Yeah. In the United States, people of color were at much higher risk of COVID. People of color in my country, Canada, an Indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of other people. This is amongst the population who never used to have autoimmune disease whatsoever. And so we're not just talking about individual choices or even individual personality traits. We're also talking about large social trends that exclude or oppress or put extra burden on, on certain segments of the population. So we have to really, I just want to make sure that we broaden the conversation beyond the individual to the social level as well.
And I think your book beautifully makes that case, doesn't it? That a lot of this is driven by the world around us and culture. But of course, within that, there are things that if we empower ourselves that we can do. I also want to just say, I totally agree on the 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be a barrier. Sure, more time would probably be optimal. But even having a physician who's aware and then says, and points into one of your books, for example, that's useful. I know there are thousands of medical doctors now who, certainly in the UK, because they talk to me and they contact me and they say, I've only got 10 minutes, but I just raised something and then I point them to one of your podcasts or one of your books. And so it's a way that you can, because this information, this can help patients in their own time when they're gardening at the weekend or going out for a walk. They can be learning. And that's one of the things that gives me hope at the moment is that this information is not behind locked doors in universities and research institutions. People are consuming this content. If you look at your talks on YouTube, millions of people have watched them and are then empowering themselves. So, Gabor, as we come towards the end of this conversation, just to close a loop on something you mentioned earlier, which is women and increased rates of chronic disease. I don't want to leave that open-ended. Could you just explain maybe why you think there may be a relationship there?
Well, if you take something like multiple sclerosis, which I've mentioned a number of times, the gender ratio in the 30s was about 1 to 1. So if each man diagnosed, there'd be a woman. The gender ratio now is 3.5 women for every man. Now that tells us a few things immediately. Can't be genetics, because that doesn't change over a short period of time. Can't be the diet or the climate, because that doesn't change more for one gender than the other. What is it? It's stress. Now, if you look at those 4 character traits that I said contributed to the onset of illness, the emotional concern for the needs of others, the suppression of healthy anger, the identification with duty, role, and responsibility, the belief that you're responsible for the people's emotions and you mustn't disappoint anybody. Which gender is acculturated in our society to take on those traits more than the other? Of course, it's women. So women have 80% of autoimmune disease. 80% of autoimmune disease are women. And a big mystery. It's not a mystery. They're acculturated to play a certain role. Their role has always been to absorb the stresses of their families and also of their spouses. And certainly that's a role that my wife took on early in our relationship, and she had to rebel against it to stay healthy. There was a study in Sweden that showed that, this is remarkable, that if a woman was depressed prenatally, that increased the risk of a late premature birth, 32 weeks to 36 weeks. If the man was depressed, the father was depressed prenatally, that increased the risk of an even earlier premature birth. Why? Because the woman was absorbing the stress of the man. And so women do that automatically, not biologically necessarily, but because that's the role they've been given in the society. Plus that they have to go out and work now as well to make a living and to make money for the family to survive or to succeed out there in the workforce. And people are more isolated than they ever were. So in Britain, they appointed a minister of loneliness. So greater stress, more isolation. That's why women are getting more autoimmune disease. And during COVID, there was an article in the New York Times about women who took on the emotional stress of their husbands and their children during COVID, and they felt guilty because of the suffering of their men and their children, because it was somehow their job to eliminate or alleviate it. Well, that socially appointed and then automatically assumed role that women have been thrust into has physical implications. That's why women get most autoimmune disease. What if we just recognize this? Yeah. You know, and this big mystery. No mystery. This is a particular dramatic example of the biopsychosocial nature of human beings. Yeah. Our biology is inseparable from our psychological functioning and our social relationships. Yeah. And who has the brunt of all that? Women of color. Yeah. They're much more likely to develop these diseases than Caucasian women. Why? Because of the added stress of social and racial oppression or exclusion.
I guess the culture, the society around us impacts so much of how we experience the world and what we chase and what we pursue and how we are. And of course, it can take a long time for culture to change.
Yeah. I'm not saying that people have to wait for the society to change. If they did wait, it'd be a long, long wait, I would think. So there's a lot that we can do, even in the context of this culture. Now, of course, what we can do is not totally freely available equally to everybody. Let's face it, certain classes of people have fewer options than others. That's just the reality of this culture that we have to really look in the face, you know. But there's still a lot that people can do. But if I can go back to the confluence of your book and mine, you have these three concepts of the healing concepts of alignment, which is I call authenticity, becoming true to ourselves. That's available to all of us. You talk about contentment, which I talk about in terms of acceptance, just actually recognizing how things are and being with them. Not necessarily that we don't want anything to be different, but that we don't stress ourselves about things. Thirdly, what you call control, which is we've already talked about, what I call agency. Those are some core healing principles that, interestingly enough, both you and I, without any discussion or awareness of what each of us is writing, why did we come up with that? Because they're real. And we've seen them both in medical practice and the function of them. Now, I add anger, another A called anger, which I think is very important for people to be able to say no and we have a system in our brain for healthy aggression. Yeah. Just as we have one for play, for love, for lust, for fear, for grief, we have systems in our brain for anger. Why? Because it has to protect us. So I think people need to be angry, not enraged, not chronically resentful, but they have to be able to say, no, you will not do this to me. No, you will not enter my space. No, you will not manipulate me. No, you will not use me. So that's a small microcosmic statement of my healing principles, but I certainly think that healing is possible. And let's face it, if you didn't think healing was possible, would you write your books? You know, I mean, if all you wanted to do is tell people how terrible things are, you wouldn't write a book. No. We both write books because we actually believe in human beings, in the capacity of human beings for transformation, and that there's some guidance that can be provided to promote that transformation. That's why we write, and that's why I wrote this book. And so, yes, healing is possible, but we have to be aware. I think you said earlier, we have to wake up to what's going on. Yeah. Until then, we're just working in the dark.
Your book, Scattered Minds, is a fabulous read. And actually, a very close friend of mine read that book about 3 years ago and realized through reading it that they had ADD and, you know, has taken steps in their own life to try and address it. But, you know, this is where labels, again, not to be too black or white, this is where labels can be helpful, at least initially, to know, oh, I'm not crazy, I'm not mad, there's nothing wrong with me. This is what I've got because of what happened when my brain was developing. Now that I know that, I'm empowered to do something about it rather than be a victim to this thing that just happened and there's nothing I can do. So I think that's really important. But I wonder if you could just clarify, Gabor, ADD, ADHD. These are terms that I think people have heard of. So could you just clarify what those two abbreviations are? And then what would critics of your work say about the way you view ADD? What would they say and how would you counteract that?
So the diagnosis simply means that you have these traits of distractibility, tuning out, poor attention skills. So your mind tends to be elsewhere a lot of the time. An unwilled kind of tuning out. Most people tune out sometimes, but people with ADD tend to do it much more than the average person does, and it does interfere with their capacity to learn or to complete tasks and so on sometimes. So that's the attention part. The H part, which is sometimes present, sometimes isn't, it also means poor impulse regulation. So when something occurs, people tend to blurt things out and say things, and their mind tend to wander a lot. And sometimes when you talk to a person with ADD, like they'll start talking about one thing, and that one thing leads to something else. And if you don't stop them, an hour later they're still talking far away, tangentially far away from the original point of the conversation. So that's the distractibility, attention part, poor impulse regulation. I've certainly had that in my life. And then the AH part, if it's present, is the hyperactivity, difficulty sitting still, being uncomfortable, being bored easily, wanting to move and get away from things. Generally, when I go to public meetings, unless I'm the speaker, I tend to sit at the back so I can make a quick getaway in case I get bored, In a classroom, the very hyper kids, you can easily recognize them because they have trouble sitting still, so they're the ones that are easily diagnosed. Now, I'm saying that all these are normal responses to stresses on highly sensitive kids in early life. What the critics would say is that, number one, this is a genetic disorder. It runs in families. Therefore, it's not a question of the environment. Secondly, it's biological. It has to do with lack of dopamine in the brain. And therefore, when we give somebody a medication that elevates dopamine levels, which is the incentive motivation chemical, they cannot pay attention. Now, I've taken medication. It's true. It helped me. When I wrote Scattered Minds, I was taking a stimulant. That helped me, What I say in response to the critics, though, is number one, just because something runs in families, it doesn't make it genetic. I mean, you're a medical doctor. I'm a medical doctor. If our kids became medical doctors, which there's no risk in my case of that happening, would that mean that the practice of medicine is a genetic disorder? In other words, could be, but maybe it isn't. In other words, there's a way in which we pass on stuff that's environmental rather than genetic. And my kids didn't experience stress the way I did. There was no war, but they grew up in a family of origin where there was a lot of conflict between the parents.
Yeah.
And that had an impact on them. So we can pass on stuff, not genetically, but through these circumstances. As far as the biology is concerned, this is what the average psychiatrist doesn't understand because they're not taught it.
Yeah.
That the biology of the brain is shaped by the emotional environment. So yes, there's biology involved, but that biology is not determined by genetics. What is genetic here is what I've said about Harry and a lot of other people. There are genes for sensitivity. So here's the shinny on genetics and mental health. For all the talk about depression and bipolar illness and schizophrenia and ADHD and being genetic, there's no gene or group of genes that if you have them, you'll have a certain disease. There's no gene or group of genes that if you don't have them, you will not have that mental health condition. What there is, and every time they think they've discovered some gene for an illness, 2 years later, they have to retract it. What there is, it seems to be, this is as best I can understand the latest research, there's a large group of genes that the more of them you have, the more likely to have any number of mental health conditions, but no specific one. What is being actually transmitted genetically is sensitivity. Mm-hmm. The more sensitivity genes you have, the more likely you'll be affected by the environment. Yeah. So when there's dysfunction, trauma, stress in the environment, you'll be more affected by somebody who's not as sensitive as you are genetically. That's what's genetic here. But the so-called diseases are not. The diseases themselves, as I keep pointing out, or what we call diseases, are so-called diseases are adaptations. Yeah. The depression is an adaptation. The so-called personality disorder, not trusting people, it's an adaptation. The tuning out of ADHD, it's an adaptation on the part of sensitive children to stresses in their environment.
Gabor, last time we spoke, we mentioned the unique pressures on women in society today. You've written a whole chapter on this in The Myth of Normal, how women are society's, I think, shock absorbers, I think is how you referred to them. And you drew the strong connection between women's roles and the fact that 70 to 80% of autoimmune diseases are afflicted to women, right? So we've covered that. And I think it's really, really interesting. This is not really in relation to Harry. I want to broaden it out beyond Harry, because I think Harry had some quite unique pressures that most of us, 99.9% of the world's population, will never know what sort of expectation there is to behave a certain way, to be a certain way, to perform a certain way when you're a prince, right? So I don't think that's maybe that relatable. But the point I'm trying to get to is there's unique pressures on women in society, but there's also unique toxic pressures on men. What do you see as the key difference between what we're being asked to do? And is it biological or is it cultural?
Well, deep question. Statistically, women are much more likely to be diagnosed with PTSD, double with anxiety and depression. They tend to take, they're the ones who tend to take psychiatric medications much more often than men do, statistically. And I don't think that has to do with any biological determinant. It has to do with what you just summarized, which is that women tend to act as the emotional shock absorbers. So very often, there's a fascinating study out of Sweden. They looked at premature birth. If a woman had depression during pregnancy, I think in the first trimester or the second, that increased their chance of premature birth, late premature birth, so 32 weeks or afterwards. But if the father had depression, that increased the chance of even earlier premature birth.
Wow.
Now, how do we explain that? Because the woman absorbs the stresses of the husband. So, and that affects her physiology. So the reason women are more likely to be diagnosed, quite apart from the fact that being a woman in society, being a female child, really exposes you to trauma. Not that being a male protects you from it, but sexual abuse, which happens to men as well, young boys as well, as we know, is more likely to happen to a young girl. And so trauma, that particular form of trauma, which is a significant risk factor for mental health conditions, depression, substance abuse, anxiety, and so on, happens to young girls more. So, and then there's the general role of women as shock absorbers. Now, men also suffer, just as you say, but the way that men are acculturated is to act out their stresses, whereas women act them in. So that in the women, it has to be more internal. The man will act out his suffering through substance use or through violence, through dominating a woman, through finding a woman to absorb his stresses. You know, there's this toxic masculinity. When you talk to men with PTSD, soldiers who've been in battle and come back with severe symptoms, one of the things that inhibit their healing is the expectation that they should be tough and suck it up and not talk about their vulnerability.
To make sure you're taking action after watching this video, I've created a free breathing guide that's going to help you reduce stress, calm your mind, and boost your energy. In this guide, I share with you 6 really simple breathing practices that work immediately. Even just 1 minute a day will start to make a big difference. To receive your free guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
So that the expectation on men not to be vulnerable is a huge source of pressure and dysfunction for men. And when they heal, these tough veterans who've had their friends killed, who they themselves may have been injured, who've killed others, they soften up. They start finding their tears. They start finding their vulnerability that they've had to suppress all their lives. So that's how it works with men.
Yeah.
And, Harry and I did talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnerare, to wound. And human beings are profoundly vulnerable from conception until death. We're all vulnerable. We can all be wounded. But in our society, men are expected to stifle and hide and reject their vulnerability. Don't be a sissy. We associate vulnerability with feminine qualities that we're supposed to disdain. Yeah. And that's a big pressure on men.
Thank you. Gabor, just to finish off this conversation, I think there's just 2 points to try and address. In relation to what you've just said about the importance of vulnerability for men and women, but let's say particularly men in the context of what you've just said, you are actually someone who I think is a pretty phenomenal example of that. You share your vulnerability in every single one of your books. And actually in our last conversation, the third conversation we had together on this podcast, you shared a story that when Daniel, one of your children, was young, you mentioned and you shared openly how you slapped him across the face for something that you can now reflect on and see as being very trivial. Now, what's really interesting is that when we put that out, it's amazing to see how triggering content like that can be for people. Now, some people are admiring you and going, wow, this is why I love Dr. Maté. He's sharing. He's not trying to present himself as being perfect. But other people are being very judgmental and saying, I can't believe he just admitted child abuse in public. This is not something to be celebrated. This is something he should be ashamed about, right? So again, we have a very polarized debate around you sharing something that you're not looking for sympathy for. You're just trying to say, this is a matter of fact. This is what happened. This is what I did. This has been the consequence. So I think there's a wider point here, which is about blame. Okay, it relates to the Prince Harry conversation. It relates to even how we talk about the royal family. Your conversation with Prince Harry, what I've heard of it and from what you've explained, was not about blaming his brother or his father or his uncle or his grandma, right? It was simply about saying what is. It was understanding that we're all playing out our trauma. We're all doing the best we can based upon what we've experienced. You mentioned Prince Charles now, King Charles, how he was brought up and how he was taught to show affection. So of course he's going to replay that. So I want to really just make sure we get across that we're trying to be compassionate. We're not blaming anyone, but also for people, Gabor, who hear what you're saying about, oh, if the mother's stressed during pregnancy, the child's more likely to be stressed. A lot of people go immediately to guilt and they go, oh man, I was so stressed during my pregnancy. Oh, I did this to my child. So I wonder if you could wrap up those themes together and leave people on an inspiring note, if that's possible.
Sure. Well, when we talk about the importance of pregnancy and early childhood, almost inevitably it brings up a lot of remorse in a lot of parents. And there's no question about it. But it's not about blaming anybody, because they all did their best.
Yeah.
When Prince Charles came into Harry's room and told him, your mother has died, touches him on the knee and says, it's going to be okay, and leaves, he was doing his best. That was his best based on what happened to him as a child. There's nobody to be blamed here. When I hit my son when he was 3 years old, I'm not proud of it. I have remorse about it. But it happened. And I have to understand what happened and why I did it. And I didn't do it deliberately. It just came upon me, and it had consequences. And my son Daniel and I just wrote this book together, The Myth of Normal, that you've mentioned. And we're writing another book together called Hello Again, a fresh start for adult children and their parents. Just yesterday, I arrived home from a hiking trip that I did with my two adult sons. So when I talk about this stuff, it's to say, first of all, don't blame yourself. You're not different from me. I'm not different from everybody else. We do our best, but our best sometimes can be very hurtful to the next generation because of our own unresolved stuff. And secondly, we can look this in the eye. We can actually deal with it. And without shame, understand what happened. You can have remorse. But shame, making yourself wrong and thinking you're a terrible person, that's not helpful to anybody. And to all the parents who say, I passed on my stresses to your kids. Sometimes when I give talks, some people say, I'm afraid I've screwed up my kids. And I say to all those people who think, you screwed up my kids, I said, don't worry about it. Of course you did. We all do. That's what happened. But if each generation we can just heal a little bit or a lot, we'll pass on a lot less. And what I say to all parents is, what morning, who feel guilty, I say to them, what morning did you wake up and decide to screw up your kids? Was it a Saturday afternoon that you made the decision to screw up your kids? Was it Monday morning? Were you 19 or 25 or 35 when you made that decision? People laugh. Nobody makes that decision to trouble or to hurt their kids. We just do. But it's not a guilt. It's not a fault. It's not a deliberate act. It's just the unresolved impacts of our own trauma. And that can be healed. And the more as parents we heal, the more we heal our kids. Yeah. And that healing is a lifelong process. And so that the fact that my sons and I just came back from this beautiful hiking trip in Utah, and that my son and Daniel and I are writing 2 books together, that's an example of the healing that can happen, both each in ourselves and also in our relationships. So to go back to why talk about all this stuff, precisely the point is, if you recognize that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with us, but that many of our dysfunctions, mental health conditions, challenges are the outcomes of traumas. That's not victimization or passing off responsibility. That is the seizing of responsibility. Because when I understand what happened, now it's my responsibility and my liberty to find the healing. So to me, it's an entirely positive message. Yeah. And across all mental health conditions, if we understand the wounding that's at the heart of them, we can heal that wound. Sometimes we will require medications to get us through a difficult time. That's all right. But the medications don't heal anything. Yeah. The healing has to involve getting help, looking at yourself, and understanding the wounding, and to realize that you're not that wound. Yeah. And that wound can be healed at any time. That's my message.
Thank you, Gabor. I think it's so powerful when someone as respected as yourself in this field shares things like that. I think it's great when people like Prince Harry share that you can get traumatized anywhere. And this, it really speaks to honesty, helping people understand, because without the honesty and the self-awareness, you're never going to change. We're unconscious until we're not. As Maya Angelou says, once you know better, you do better.
In response to what you just said about until we're not conscious, remember Pinocchio? Pinocchio is this puppet who wants to become a real boy. And as long as traumatic dynamics run our lives, we really are like puppets on a string. We're being pulled by unconscious forces. And to recognize the trauma and to heal it is to liberate ourselves from those strings. You know what Pinocchio says at the end of the book when he becomes a real boy? He says, "I was so foolish when I was a puppet." Well, we're all so foolish when we're puppets, and none of us have to be.
Gabor, it's great that we can raise awareness of these issues, but what can people actually do to start healing themselves?
Yeah, so this question very much came up in my conversation with Prince Harry, and reading his book, but also, doing my own work and observing. There's certain principles or practices, and some of them show up in his book. So therapy. So in other words, just asking for help, talking to somebody when that's available to you, absolutely essential. Just when I needed help recently, I reached out for help, asking for help. A peer counselor, a professional, but somebody, don't be alone with it, in other words. Share it, talk about it. That's the first principle. Harry, in his own book, writes very beautifully about his experience of nature. Nature was very healing for him. Being outdoors in the Arctic or actually the Antarctic or in Africa. My boys and I just came back from this week-long hiking trip in Utah. Incredible mountains and rocks and sunsets and sunrises. Nature is harmonizing. In our society, we're so alienated from nature. We have to get back into nature to heal. Harry talked about meditation being very important for him. Now, that's not easy for an ADD brain to do, or for any brain to do. But, recently, I've been rededicating myself to awareness. So when I eat now, I was just reading a book by the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who died over a year ago now. Wonderful teacher of mindfulness. Eating mindfully, walking mindfully, being aware, really powerfully important for healing. Doesn't cost a penny. Relationships. In my own healing, my marriage relationship has been such a reality check. I know that's true for Harry as well. We talked about that a bit. He talks about it in his book. I know it's true for your marriage because you've talked a bit about, your relationship with your wife, and she's the one that provides the reality principle. Brings you back to yourself and grounds you and calls you on your stuff. So I think relationship is really important for healing. Harry mentioned service to other people. In other words, living a life that isn't just for you, isn't a life that isn't all about what can I acquire, attain, and achieve and possess, but how do I give to others? People find that incredibly healing as well. Spirituality, whatever that means for you, but the sense that we're part of something larger than just the individual isolated ego, that we are connected, that we belong, that we are part of a unity. That's incredibly healing. And I know Harry's had some of those experiences of recognition of unity and connection. Now, spirituality means different things to different people. We each have, nobody can prescribe it to anybody else. But in the indigenous medicine wheel in North America, they talk about the 4 quadrants of health, which is mental, physical, social, and spiritual. So that's spirituality. And you come from a country where there's a lot of spiritual tradition and practice and wisdom. So that's an important part, whatever form that takes for you. And then Harry and I talked about psychedelics as well. We both had experiences with it. He told me, how did he put it? He said that, I have this written down because I'm going to remember his exact words, but he said that the psychedelics didn't simply allow me to escape reality for a while. They helped me redefine reality. And he got to see that there's more to him than just in the individual isolated self. So for him, as in my own life, in my own clinical work as well, and again, there was a lot of negative commentary about this in the British press who didn't know what the heck they were talking about. Psychedelics are not a panacea. They're not for everybody. They're not without their risks. But believe me, I've seen so many people undergo such profound healing with the help of psychedelic substances, whether it's natural plants like ayahuasca or mushrooms, or whether it's human-made substances like MDMA. I've seen incredible healing for mental health conditions because the psychedelics remove a kind of membrane between the conscious and the unconscious mind, and they help you see what's underneath it. Yeah. So in the right context, they can be very helpful as well. So these are some of the modalities of healing. Now, in terms of therapy, there's all kinds. There's internal family systems, Dick Schwartz, that I think you know very well. Yeah. There's compassion inquiry, which is what I teach. There's sensory motor psychotherapy of Pact Ogden. There is Bessel van der Kolk's amazing work, Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. There's EMDR. There are many modalities, none of which are taught in the average medical school, and yet all of which go way beyond the narrow view of mental illness. And they all affect, or they all address the fundamental traumatic conditions that give rise to mental illness, or what we call mental illness. So lots of healing modalities out there. Some of them freely available to us. Some of them we have to seek out, but nobody needs to be stuck. Nobody needs to be stuck.
Yeah, Gabor, thank you for sharing that. Throughout this conversation, we've both been very mindful to talk about privilege and opportunity. And of course, someone like Prince Harry would no doubt have had the resources and access to some of the best therapists out there. Now, of course, you mentioned statistics from people in more deprived communities than, let's say, Prince Harry, certainly from a physical and materialistic viewpoint. For someone, because these conversations go all over the world, right? So there'll be somebody listening or watching to this right now who has resonated with a lot of this content and who is thinking, you know what, yeah, that's me. I'm being driven by patterns from my past. Trauma is driving so much of what I'm doing. I've just had a realization, but I've got no money. I can't access a therapist or whatever it might be. To that person, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, yes, that's a real dilemma. And I wish I had an easy answer for it. I do wish that healthcare providers, systems like the National Health Service in Britain or the Canadian system understood the importance of psychological healing and did provide resources for it. Now, in fact, they're depriving resources rather than increasing them. But I do wish that systems understood that people need these kind of services, number one. But that's a hope. It's not a reality. I would say, look, yeah, but it's true. But there's lots of content online that is free. This conversation is online. It's going to be free. I'm sure, Rangan, that you've had people approach you or write to you saying that this podcast really changed my life. I don't mean this podcast with me. I mean some of your other podcasts, including perhaps some of them with me. So you can gain a lot of insight and self-awareness by a lot of free content that's on the internet. Yeah. There's the books that you've written, the books that I've written, that many other wonderful colleagues have written. They're available in libraries, published in many languages. People can read them. People can self-reflect. People can find peer counseling. People can join groups online or in person to find support. People can walk out in nature. They can meditate. Lots of free meditation instruction on the internet or available in wonderful books, including by the aforementioned Thich Nhat Hanh. There's journaling. There's expressing your emotions through art if you have the talent or the interest. So there's a lot of things that people can do. You don't need to be. And talk to your friends. If you have good friends that can listen to you, Just ask them to listen.
Stress is endemic these days. The World Health Organization still calls stress the health epidemic of the 21st century, right? So how do you see stress and how do you see its relationship to disease?
Well, it's one of those, as you imply, it's one of those words with a double meaning. And it all depends how we use it. A related word is psychosomatic. Like you and I both know, in the best possible sense of the word, that a lot of illnesses are genuinely psychosomatic, because psyche means their emotional apparatus and soul, if you will, and soma is the body. And because of the mind-body unity and the unshakable unity of our emotional system and the brain's emotional circuits, with the nervous system, the immune system, and the hormonal apparatus, it's a unit. It's a psychosomatic unit. That's a really great word. But when most people hear psychosomatic, they think we're just telling them they're imagining their diseases, which is very often how doctors have used it.
Yeah.
And it's the same with stress. Now, stress is a genuine psychophysiological event. Stress isn't some fancied, imagined fantasy on the part of the patient. Stress is actually what happens when the organism faces pressures that are beyond its capacity to deal with chronically. And that results in the release of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, amongst other things. Stress also affects the immune system. Stress affects the gut. Stress affects the brain. It affects the heart. We mentioned high blood pressure. What's the medical term for hypertension? For high blood pressure? Hypertension. And we, as physicians, we're trained that, well, there's 5% of hypertension is explainable due to kidney disease or some hormonal abnormality, but 95% is what we call essential hypertension, which means we haven't got a clue what's causing it. Come on, people. Read the word. Hypertension. Hypertension. Too much tension. That's what causes hypertension. I mean, and those from all kinds of studies. In other words, it's the impact of stress and high levels of adrenaline on the cardiovascular system. Now, when your doctor uses the word stress and the patient thinks that I'm being dismissed, they often are being dismissed because the physician himself or herself or themselves don't recognize the unity of mind and body.
Yeah.
So when the word leaves their lips, they do mean a kind of dismissive, I can't find anything physically wrong with you, therefore it's just stress. Well, that's not how it works. In the genuine sense of the word, as we know from millions of studies, stress has huge impacts, and they have impacts even sometimes when we can't measure them, when we don't have the clinical tools to measure something. You mentioned fibromyalgia earlier. Well, there's no clinical test that'll diagnose or rule out fibromyalgia, but it's clearly a stress-related condition. And when you study people's lives with fibromyalgia, salient amongst the findings is significant degrees of childhood trauma and childhood adversity and their impacts on the body.
Yeah. Can we at that point, Gabor, just explain what exactly do you mean when you say childhood trauma?
Well, geez, I'm so glad to be able to talk about that, because that's another word that's, on the one hand, not appreciated, understood, even recognized by much of medical practice. On the one hand, on the other hand, is used too loosely sometimes. So people say, I went to a movie last night and I was really traumatized. No, you weren't. You just were upset. You were sad. You were, angry. But that doesn't mean you were traumatized. So what does it mean? What does trauma mean? Well, again, if you look at the word origins, the origin of the word trauma is a Greek phrase for wounding or a wound. So trauma is a wound that you sustained. Now, when people think of the word trauma, they often believe it has to do with what we call the big T events, the big trauma events, such as sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, a parent dying, violence in the family, parental addiction, maybe a rancorous divorce. These are traumatic, but trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is what happened inside you as a result of what happened to you. So trauma is the psychic wound that you sustained. That's the first point. the second point is if we understand the nature of a wound, really there's two ways to look at a wound. If it stays open, it's very sore. You touch it. If I pat myself on the shoulder right now, I feel no pain. But if there was a wound there and my shoulder was bare and my nerve endings were close to the surface, in other words, if I was thin-skinned, and if I tap myself with the same force, there'd be severe pain. So one aspect of trauma is like an open sore that if you touch it, you just react like you were just wounded all over again. That's one aspect of a wound. The other way to look at a wound is that it forms a scar. The scar tissue protects the wound, but at the same time it's thick, it's inflexible, it's hard, it's not capable of growth, and it lacks nerve endings, so you don't feel. So trauma both sensitizes us to certain stimuli, and on the other hand, numbs us to our own feelings and separates us from our bodies because it's too painful to be in our bodies. Now, to traumatize people, you can do bad things to them, as I mentioned earlier. But you can also wound people, particularly sensitive kids, but all kids, but especially highly sensitive children, not just by doing bad things to them, but by not giving them the good things that they need. So it's not just what shouldn't have happened but did, but what should have happened but didn't. So for this, we have to understand children's basic needs. Children have certain developmental needs for healthy emotional and brain development. One of them is to be seen and heard and to be accepted for exactly who they are without any condition. Now, lots of people tell me they had happy childhoods, nothing traumatic. But when I delve into them, their histories even a little bit, that lack of unconditional acceptance and understanding and being seen is salient. You can hurt people that way. That can wound people. And so these traumas then show up in all kinds of coping mechanisms and adaptations. Many of them, we call them mental illnesses. Like, take something like depression. Again, look at a word origin. What does it mean to depress something? You push something down. Now, what gets pushed on in depression, and I've been diagnosed with that, what gets pushed on in depression is your emotions. But why would you push down your emotions? You push down your emotions when to feel them puts you at odds with your environment. So that if your parents can't handle your verve and your enthusiasm, or your sadness or your grief or your anger, then in order to fit in with the family environment, you will push down those feelings, not consciously, but simply as a matter of automatic adaptation. 30 years later, you're diagnosed with this disease called depression. But it was a response to a childhood wounding, the wounding of not being seen and accepted with all your emotions, which is another essential need of the child. The child should be able to experience all their emotions, no matter what they are. So that's a very simple example of childhood wounding trauma, which then shows up in the form of adult distress. And I can show the similar patterns for all manner of chronic illness, that there was childhood wounding either because of things happening that shouldn't have, or what I call the small t trauma of things not happening that should have, that then leads to adaptations, which adaptations in the long term promote illness.
There's a couple of things there, right? So childhood trauma then shows up later in a whole variety of different behaviors, a whole variety of different diseases. Right. So there's the question there is then, as an adult, how can we start addressing this? But there's also another piece, which is many people listening or watching are parents themselves. And they may recognize certain things and certain behaviors they've had in their own life, as I certainly have done. But there's also, well, how do we not traumatize, or shall I say, minimize the trauma that we put onto our kids? You know, what are those, if we maybe start there, because we're living in a society where it's very hard to be a parent, it's very hard to be a mother.
It's very hard.
You know, really hard. And actually, through no fault of parents, they're struggling to be present and have time and patience with their children. I know in the book you write that being understood as a child is as much of a need as food and shelter, which I found really profound.
Yeah.
Being understood, being seen, being heard.
Yeah.
Right. So what can parents think about when trying to bring up their kids?
So first of all, it's very important to avoid any hint of parent blaming, as you say. And so it's not a matter of individual failure. It's really a question of a society that doesn't put children's needs in the forefront at all. And so let's take a really simple example. Now, in the book, I talk about my personal history, which is, a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation in Hungary. Very dramatic, be a terrible time in history to be an infant.
Yeah.
And my mother and I live under really deplorable conditions, under the threat of death. And at one point, she gives me up to a total stranger in the street. By the way, I was just in Budapest, my home city, 2 weeks ago, and I swam every morning at a sports club. It was right across the house where my mother gave me to a stranger.
Oh, wow.
77 years ago, to save my life. So that's very dramatic. But forget the Nazis, forget genocide, forget the war. When my mother and I are still in the hospital, maternity hospital, and I'm 2 weeks old, she writes in her diary, "My poor little Gabor, my heart is breaking for you because you've been crying for the last an hour and a half, wanting to be fed. But I promised the doctor I'd only feed you every 4 hours. So it's not time yet. You're going to have to learn that nighttime is for sleeping, not for eating." Her heart was breaking. She's completely suppressing her parental instinct to please the doctor. So forget the war, forget the genocide, forget all the drama. Just a mom, a 24-year-old mom, following doctor's orders. Now, in this society, parents are often advised to ignore their kids' needs, just like that. For example, you have this thing called sleep training, where parents are told, don't pick up the crying child. Now, you tell a mother orangutan not to pick up their crying child. You tell a mother cat to ignore the cries and distress of their infant. But we tell human beings this every day, and we call this sleep training, and what we're doing is giving the child the message. Now, it works. You ignore a child's cries for 4 nights, they're going to sleep through the night. You know why? Because they give up. And they can't stand it. They put themselves to sleep just to get away from the distress of it. And their brain is flooded with cortisol, which interferes with healthy brain development. And the message they get is that their feelings don't matter, that they're on their own, they're all alone. Now, this is done by loving parents under the advice of well-meaning professionals, and we call this parenting advice. Or another simple little device that parents are often told to do, time out. Now, there's a very famous Canadian psychologist who I don't need to name, but in his mega-selling book, he advises parents that an angry little child should be made to sit by themselves until they come back to normal. It's not normal for a 2-year-old to be angry, and that child should be excluded. The message the child should get is, you're not acceptable to us when you have that emotion. A lot of parents, there's best-selling books on this technique of time out, which basically means separating the child from yourself until they start behaving in ways that you can approve of. In other words, the message to the child is, your acceptance is purely conditional on your pleasing me. Now, we're not talking about parents that are beating their kids. We're not talking about parents who don't love their kids. We're not talking about parents who are trying to hurt their kids. We're just talking about parents who are complying with social norms and social values. Then there's the factor of stress that you mentioned, how stressful it is to be parenting. Again, we're not meant to parent in isolated homes, in one-person or two-parent families. We're meant to parent in groups, in community. This is how we evolved as a species. We know already, and I spent chapters on this, that chapter on prenatal life, that stress on the pregnant woman. I mentioned telomeres earlier.
Yeah.
The telomeres of infants born to highly stressed mothers are shorter already at birth. This is a new study that just came out since I wrote the book. So stress on pregnant women. Now, how are we taking care of pregnant women in our society? Are we honoring their needs? Are we making provisions for them on the job, or even to give them prenatal leave to take care of themselves? Or are we telling husbands to really look after their wives' emotional needs? I mean, I talk about in the book about just what an unsupportive husband I was when I was, when we were expecting our children. That has an impact on the developing child already in the womb. Not because the mother doesn't love the child, but because when she's stressed, that stress translates into physiological impacts on the child. Now, there are times in the first year of life when every second, millions of circuits, millions of connections are being made in the brain. The mother's emotional states directly affect the brain development of the child. We know this from scientific studies. How are we taking care of new mothers in this society? What support are we giving them? How do we ensure that they have the best possible environment to raise that child? And so what I'm saying is that this society is so stressful. And look, in Britain, I'm in Britain right now. I read the newspaper. 10% inflation rate while the economy is shrinking. How does that affecting, one of the triggers for stress is uncertainty.
Yeah.
So this is a society, this rich society that massively stresses its population. And those stressed parents then are supposed to raise healthy children.
Yeah.
So that with lousy advice from experts to ignore the child's needs. I'm not even talking about trauma in the big sense.
Yeah. You've been very open in the book about things that maybe you could have done better, whether it's...
To say the least.
Yeah, and it's, it's interesting. It's very insightful to read that from you. And I guess as you talk about your children there and how you maybe didn't give your wife as much support as you could have done.
It was worse than that. I stressed her.
Yeah.
I added to her stress.
So you added to her stress, it had an impact on your children.
Yeah.
You're writing about more and more the research on the long-term implications of that.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that now? Have you made peace with it? Or do you beat yourself up?
Well, so this book that we're discussing was written with the brilliant help of my eldest son, who's a lyricist and a musical theater writer, but he's just a wonderful writer. And I couldn't have done it without him. And he's now, as the book comes out, he'll be 47 years old. This is the kid that when he was 3 years old, I slapped across the face because he wouldn't think happy birthday to me. Now, the story's worth telling. It was my birthday party, and we had gathered at my parents' place. My mother made me a traditional Hungarian meal, for my birthday. And my brothers were there with their wives, their families, my parents, my wife and I, and our eldest son, 3 years old. And Daniel, my co-writer on this book, announces, "I'm not singing happy birthday." And I said, "If you're not singing, you're not getting cake." "Well, I'm not singing anyway." I get more and more angry. Everybody's begging me to desist. Everybody's begging me to lay off. The more they ask me to do that, the more angry I get. I ended up hitting him. Now, what was that all about? He was just being a 3-year-old. He says, "I'm going to assert my own personality. I'm not going to go along with the crowd, I might have said, "Hey, Daniel, sweetheart, don't sing, just have the cake and enjoy it." What was being triggered in me is the sense I developed as a young child that I wasn't loved and lovable. So I needed this 3-year-old to prove to me that I was lovable. When he didn't, I got enraged. I'm not either criticizing myself or defending myself. I'm just saying, this is what happened. This is how we passed on our trauma unwittingly. So one of the pieces of advice I give to parents is, deal with your trauma as much as you can, as you have children and before you have children and as you're raising them. Now, in terms of my own trajectory with my kids, we've done a lot of repair, a lot of healing. And even writing this book together has been a tremendously healing process. Yeah. I mean, we've had our moments, believe me, when we're each other's throats. In fact, we have another book contract. The next book we're writing together is going to be called Hello Again, a fresh start for adult children and their parents.
Oh, love it.
Yeah, so that as soon as the hoopla on this book settles down, which I hope won't for a long time, but as soon as it does, we're going to start writing that book together. So yeah, we've made the repair, and that repair is possible. But to young parents, I would say, don't make the repair necessary. Yeah. You know, work on your own stuff. You learned something very important about yourself as your 6-month-old got ill. And I've heard you say that the greatest value to you is not your success as a physician or anything else, but the healthy raising of your children.
Yeah.
Now, if you'd asked me that when my kids were small, I would have said, yeah, my highest value is the happiness of my own children. If you'd asked me that. But if you looked at my life, that's not what you would have seen. You would have seen somebody consumed with success, consumed with professional security, consumed with his egoic concerns. So what I would say to parents is really do a valuation of what's important to you. And to use your phrase, look at how your life is aligned with what your best intentions are when it comes to parenting. It's not a question of not making mistakes. Of course you will. But if you actually live a life that even in this stressful society with all the pressures on you has its core value, the genuine needs and well-being of your children, you're going to do okay.
Yeah. Some parents are likely to have heard what you said about sleep training.
Yeah.
And I imagine they will have gone through their head and go, oh no, I did that with my baby. I did that with my child.
Yeah.
I didn't know any better. I was reading the latest parenting book and I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I hear you, Gabor, explain it. It totally makes sense why that possibly wasn't the most helpful thing to do. A lot of people then take that next step and go into guilt and shame. They feel bad about themselves. They start to berate themselves. It feeds an existing pattern of negative self-talk within them.
Yeah.
For someone who's doing that right now as they're listening, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I would just say I totally understand why you wanted to sleep train your child, because you might have to go to work in the morning.
Yeah.
It's not like we're hunter-gatherers carrying our babies everywhere we go. You know, we live in this harried world where there's demands on us, and a child who doesn't sleep at night really makes it difficult for us to live our lives. So I totally get it. So you should not blame yourself for that. Secondly, you should not blame yourself for accepting advice from people that you thought were experts. And but thirdly, I would ask you, what did it feel like to you? And if you ask most people, most parents would say, it broke my heart.
Yeah.
You know, and so I would say to them, henceforth, listen to yourself.
Yeah.
Because we all have these parenting instincts, but the instincts have to be evoked by the environment. And we live in an artificial environment that not only does not evoke, but in fact suppresses our innate instincts. And so, as much as possible, don't listen to the experts, listen to your heart, and deal with your stuff. And as far as guilt, look, I'm telling you, I'm 78. I just told you the story of hitting my 3-year-old, who's now 47, and helped me write the book of my life, you know. It doesn't matter what else I may write from now on. This is going to be the book that expresses the essence of what I've learned, at least so far. It's all repairable, but just wake up.
Yeah.
As soon as possible, wake up. Forget the guilt. You did your best. I'm not defending myself. My reaction to my child that night, that was my best at the time. Not proud of it, but neither am I. No, did I feel guilt? Shame? Oh yeah. I've had a lot that to deal with, but I've learned better.
Yeah.
So that just accept yourself that you're a human being who had certain traumas, certain stresses, certain wrong information. You know, there was a famous pediatrician, Benjamin Spock. I don't know if his name was well known in Britain, but for decades he was like the arbiter of how to raise children in North America. Millions of books sold. In many ways, a good man. but he talked about the tyranny of the infant who wanted to be picked up at night. Can you imagine? The tyranny of the infant who just wants to be held by his parents, her parents, which is the natural desire of any mammalian infant. Yeah. So don't blame yourself.
Yeah, blame, guilt doesn't help anything, does it? It keeps you locked.
Absolutely.
You know, and I remember, you may not remember this, or in fact, you won't remember this because it's before I knew you. I was in LA at a conference and I went to see you speak. Oh. And I was, when you took Q&A at the end, I actually asked you a question.
Really?
Yeah. This is, you know, years before I actually spoke to you on the podcast, before I even had a podcast, or I was just drawn to your work. And, you know, I was probably, I'm going to guess it was 2 or 3 years after, you know, my son was sick. And I can't remember now exactly what I asked you, but you gave a pretty hard-hitting, uncompromising, I guess an uncomfortable truth, which I really value. You know, you weren't shying away from it. You were just kind of saying, get over yourself in as compassionate a way as you could, but a very direct way, which I really needed because, you know, when my son was 6 months, he had a hypocalcemic convulsion. Secondary, so very low levels of calcium in his blood, secondary to non-existent levels of vitamin D in his body. And as somebody who used to be, I shall say now, as someone who used to be a perfectionist, I felt I'd let my son down. I felt that I had been a substandard parent and, you know, modern medicine saved his life, but it did nothing to help me understand what might have the consequences of being low in vitamin D for 6 months for the development of his immune system and all the other functions that this vitamin, or I should say hormone, does in the body. You know, this is where when we make things too binary, it gets really confusing and it keeps us locked. So we left the hospital after 5 days with, you know, them saying, yeah, you know, he's fine now, he can go. And I was thinking, well, what about everything else? You know, is this it? I made myself a vow as we were walking out of the hospital. I made myself a vow, I'm going to get my son back to full health as if this had never happened. And I became obsessed. I would read, I would study nutrition, the gut microbiome, the immune system, 4 or 5 hours a day, obsessed with one goal, to get him back to full health. And, you know, he is, you know, as of last week, he's 12. He's a thriving, happy, healthy 12-year-old boy. But I realized for the first, 5, 6 years of me being a father, I was consumed by guilt. I thought I'd let him down, and that would drive everything I really would encourage him to do. And I realized after a while, he doesn't need your guilt.
Exactly.
He doesn't need your guilt. He just wants a present dad. He doesn't, nobody else. My wife didn't think I was to blame. The medical profession didn't think I was to blame. It's a self-created story in my head.
Oh, right? Yeah. Well, so I so resonate with that. But first of all, let me just say something. You say you felt you let him down. You felt you didn't help him. Those aren't feelings. Those are beliefs.
Yeah.
You believe them. Now, if you like the feeling, it's probably shame.
Oh, yeah.
And guilt. And then if I asked you, shame and guilt, is that the first time when you felt them? You would say no. They probably go back a long, long way. In other words, your son had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
You know? And my kids have given me that message so much. Leave off with your guilt already.
Yeah.
Leave off with your mea culpas already. They say, we don't want to be seen as your mistakes. Yeah. We don't want to be seen as your failure. We're people.
That's a great point.
You know, and so that you're doing nobody any favors when you look at your children through the eyes of your own guilt, which has nothing to do with them anyway.
Yeah, completely. And I've noticed as I've done the work through IFS, through all kinds of different modalities, as I've let go of that, and I think I mostly have. I'm sure it comes up now and again at certain times, and then it's another self-awareness piece of, oh, kind of, I thought I was over that. That's coming up again. What is that part trying to say?
Well, it's interesting because I know that amongst your core values, I think you talk about integrity, compassion, and curiosity. So I teach a course called Compassionate Inquiry.
Yeah.
Where in fact, Dick Schwartz and I did a program together recently where we We talked about the differences and similarities between his approach and mine, and there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, for sure.
And so if you took the same dynamic of you and your son and your guilt, if you applied some compassionate inquiry to it, what would you find out? You would find out that you did nothing wrong. You'd find out that the guilt and the shame that you're experiencing had nothing to do with your son. They predated his birth by a couple of decades at least.
Yeah.
You know, and that you do yourself and him no favor by projecting it onto him. So again, when it comes back to parents, it's so important that you be compassionate to yourselves.
Yeah.
And if you make mistakes, rather than make yourself wrong for it, inquire. Well, why did I do that? If you want to use the IFS model, what part of me did that? What part of me hit my kid? You know, was so angry? Or if you want to use compassionate inquiry, you know, what need of mine was not being met there?
Yeah.
That led to that outrage on my part. You know, again, this is not to take anybody off the hook or to excuse any kind of behavior, but if we want to grow, we have to understand. And if we don't take a stance of compassionate curiosity towards ourselves, if you said to yourself, why did I do this? That's not a question. That's a statement full of judgment. But if you said to yourself, I wonder why I did that, that's the question.
Boom. Yeah. Latest statistics in the UK are these. 1 in 6 adults above the age of 16 report moderate to severe depressive symptoms. That's not mild, that's just moderate to severe. And over 8 million people in the UK experience an anxiety disorder at any one time. From your perspective, what's going on?
Well, and if I may add, the similar statistics, even more so, are evident in North America as well, where the rate of children's suicide is going up and the number of kids being medicated, seriously medicated for all manner of conditions is going up, where 25% of women are on a psychoactive medication of some kind, where depression, anxiety are rising, where overdoses. In the United States last year, more people died of overdoses than in America's Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan wars put together, almost twice as many in 1 year. So the mental health issue, and this is United States, May is Mental Health Month, is an increasing burden on society and on individuals. So it really means we have to rethink our perspective on mental health and mental illness, because the traditional medical view has it that it's a biological problem in the brain, usually potentiated by genetics. But if that was the case, it wouldn't be rising like the way it is, because genes don't change in the population over a short period of time. So we really have to look at broader social factors as they bear upon the individual. And the truth is that the individual cannot be separated from the environment. We're social creatures, and the functioning of our brains and our physiology is very much affected by our context. And so the question we really have to be asking is what is happening in modern society that is increasing the psychological burden on human beings?
Your latest book is called The Myth of Normal. And I think that title is incredibly apt in relation to what we're talking about. We've got to a stage now in 2023 where it's almost normal to have some level of mental health dysfunction. So from your perspective, what exactly is going on in society that is so stigmatizing, that is so toxic for our physical, mental, and emotional well-being?
Yes. Well, for that, we have to go back and ask the question, what are the needs of human beings for healthy development? And to what degree does our society or any society meet those needs? And this begins already in uterus, because we already know that stresses on pregnant women during the gestational period affect the brain development of infants in utero already. So the more stress there is on a woman when they're pregnant, the greater the risk that child is for mental health problems later on. It starts that early. And then we have to look at childbirth practices themselves, because the way nature set up childbirth, it wasn't just a matter of pushing a baby out of a womb. It was also a bonding experience. Chemically, a whole cocktail of hormones is released in the woman and the baby, oxytocin, endorphins, vasopressin, that help the bonding between mother and infant. Now, with the rising rates of intervention, unnecessary intervention, sometimes, as you and I know as physicians, obstetrical intervention is life-saving for mother and infant, and it's to be celebrated. But when we have situations where here in my province of British Columbia, there's a 40% cesarean section rate, and this is generalizing across the industrialized world. Sometimes it's even higher. We're having a massive interference with the natural process. And then we have to ask, what are the essential needs of human children for healthy development? And they include a safe, secure attachment relationship with parents who are emotionally attuned and present for them, which is increasingly difficult for parents to provide in today's stressed society. It includes the child not having to work to make the relationship work, so the child can be at rest in a relationship. It includes the freedom of the child to experience and express all their emotions. But the human brain is wired, like all mammals are wired, for certain emotions, including joy, playfulness, curiosity, grief, fear, anger. When parenting practices inhibit a child from experiencing all their emotions, that interferes with the child's brain development. And so take something like depression, just a simple example. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. What gets pushed down in depression? Well, I've had depression, and what gets pushed down is your emotions. But why would somebody push down their emotions? Because they weren't allowed to express them, because the expression of emotion threatened their relationship with their parents. And a lot of parenting practices today encourage parents to force kids to suppress their emotions. Yeah. And so there's so much where our needs are not met. And the biggest factor, I would say, Rangan, is the stress on parents. Yeah. The economic, social stress on parents and the increasing social isolation. All of these bear upon the developing child.
So much there to pick up on, Gabor. I think in one of our previous conversations, I mentioned to you a case of a young lady who I saw in my first week in general practice who had symptoms consistent with depression. And it would have been very easy to diagnose her with depression, label her, and then put her on an antidepressant. But I won't retell that entire story, but over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, by seeing her every week, by listening to her compassionately, non-judgmentally, in a way that she didn't have outside the consultation room, her symptoms just started to resolve. And that really speaks to what you said about depression. We're depressing our feelings down. And I'm looking at that case now through that lens. I simply provided a safe space where she could start to undepress those feelings, elevate those feelings, get them out. And as if by magic, her symptoms started to get better. So, yeah, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about depression. I just wanted to talk to you, though, about brain development. You mentioned there, your central thesis behind your book, to me at least, is that the culture around us is making us sick, right? This is not really an individual issue. This is a societal and environmental issue. And then, so if we then look at various aspects of modern society, at least modern Western society, when mothers and parents are having children these days, it's later than it used to be. It's often mid, late 20s, maybe into 30s, maybe sometimes into early 40s. This often coincides with them trying to make their way in their careers. Two parents working, they've moved away from home, they don't have support around them. So they're actually trying to incubate a baby inside the womb at a very stressful time. Often they're pushing themselves to try and buy a house where they can have a little garden and have room for the little one. Society doesn't make it easy for us to have that calm, relaxed, attentive environments for the woman when she's pregnant or for the children when they're born, does it?
No, and I wonder, Rangan, when you were in medical school, when you were taught prenatal care, did anybody ever suggest to you that you pay attention to the emotional needs of the pregnant mother? I wasn't taught that either. And yet, as I've already mentioned, that's a huge influence. Now, let me quote to you an article from Harvard University, from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is the world's most prestigious child developmental study organization. The article appeared in a major medical journal, Pediatrics, in February 2012. And it talked about brain development. And I'm going to quote it as best I can. It said that the architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a fragile or sturdy foundation for all the health and learning that behavior that follow. So that the architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process beginning before birth, continuing into adulthood, which means that in any process of development, you have to have the right conditions from before birth to adulthood. That's the first point. The second point is, the second sentence in that same article says that the most important influence on the development of the brain is the emotional mutuality in the relationship between parents and children, especially in the early childhood years. Now, lots of studies have shown that when parents are busy, they're stressed, they're anxious, they're economically pressured, that interferes with their capacity to emotionally connect with their children. We're not blaming parents here. They're doing their best, but they're doing their best in an abnormal environment. Abnormal from the point of view of human development, because human creatures, we evolved in a communal context where parents had lots of support, lots of companionship, and kids were always surrounded by other kids and by adults who cared for them. That's how we evolved. That's our need. Now, if you get a society that increasingly isolates and stress parents, that's going to impact the very circuitry of the child's brain. And that's going to affect the child's psychological functioning.
Yeah.
So that we know from British studies, for that matter, that mothers who are depressed, their kids are more likely to have ADHD later on. Why? Because the parents' emotional states affect the brain development of the child, and therefore the psychological development of the child as well. So what we cannot do is to separate the environment from the physiology of the brain. So in modern psychiatry, which really looks at mental health conditions, there's biological problems. The point they don't get and they ignore is that the brain's biology itself is affected by and shaped by the emotional and social context. And so when you have increasing isolation, parents who are stressed, struggling, as you say, without the community to support them anymore, with the loss of connection, of course you're going to get a lot of kids who are going to be mentally challenged and emotionally in trouble. Of course you are.
Given how important those formative years are, it would seem relatively urgent that we try and restructure elements of society to really prioritize those early years. So I know in America, I read a recent statistic that is it 25% of women within 2 weeks of giving birth are back at work. I mean,
yes.
If that is true, that's an absolutely incredible and actually very worrying statistic, and really shows us what that society is valuing and putting first. I'm interested, though, if we compare that to, let's say, Scandinavian countries where there's less financial inequality as there may be, let's say, in America. There's, I think, 9 months in some of these Scandinavian countries, 9 months of paternal leave, same amount, if not longer, maternal leave. You know, clearly as a society, we're saying, or they're saying, oh, the first 9 months are very, very important. So I'm interested, number one, do we see less rates of mental health problems in cultures like that? Perhaps we could address that first, and then I'll go into the next point.
Well, I wish I knew about Scandinavian statistics. there are significant mental health problems in the Scandinavian countries as well. But Finland, for example, is considered to be the happiest country in the world, according to a recent study. And they have very different approaches to child rearing and schooling and so on. In the Scandinavian countries, there is trauma, and it's not that they're without their problems.
No.
But they don't nearly have the rate of children being medicated or adults being medicated that North America does. As best I know, the 25% figure is accurate. Actually, I saw it in The Guardian, based on an American report. The British anthropologist, the British-American anthropologist Ashley Montague, talked about exterogestation. So there's enterogestation, which is the child in the womb, but then exterogestation is the continuing of the gestational process outside the womb, because the human child is the least mature, the least developed, the most dependent of any mammal, and our brains are far less developed than, say, that of other mammals. A horse can run on the first day of life. We can't do that for a year and a half, which means that the brain circuits that in a horse are already present at birth in a human being don't come online for another year and a half. And so that the gestational process needs to continue for a longer period of time in human beings. Now, when mothers are forced to return to work at such a high rate for economic reasons, what that amounts to is a massive abandonment of children. Ashley Montague talked about he wrote a book called Skin, The Human Significance of Touch. The importance for the biological, physiological, and mental development of the child to have skin-to-skin contact with the mother. Now, in our society, increasingly, that's less and less available.
Yeah.
That actually has an impact on the child's sense of security and safety in the world. No wonder we have rising rates of anxiety.
Yeah. Another element of culture I've really been reflecting on recently, Gabor, is about this idea of kids living with their parents. Now, it's really interesting. I'm from an Indian background. So I remember in the summers when I'd go to India and spend 6 weeks with my family, you'd have joint families, extended families, 3-4 generations living in the same house. Now, I'm not saying everything was fantastic about that. There's pros and cons with everything in life. But I was chatting to my wife a few weeks ago saying, where did this idea come from that if you're still living with your parents at age 20 or 21, you're somehow a failure in life? It seems to be a very Western idea that I absorbed as a child that I think is there. You'll see social media posts, you'll see things online where if someone at 26 is still living at home, they're almost frowned upon in this society. And again, I've just been reflecting as to where did that come from? I'm not saying necessarily we shouldn't be promoting independence. We shouldn't be encouraging people to, once they've had their child rearing, to move on with their adult lives with that strong degree of independence. But have you reflected on this? Where did this idea come from? And what do we see in tribes and more native cultures?
Well, in our society, there's a real push on parents to drive their kids towards independence, so that even at an early age, we try and push them towards independence. Mm-hmm. We think that we have to foster independence in the child by kind of pushing them away. And this enters into a lot of parenting practices. Now, actually, we forget something, which is that independence is nature's natural agenda. So if you look at bears, nature's agenda is that at some point the baby bear, the cub, goes up independent and goes off on their own and no longer dependent on the mother. The mother doesn't have to push them towards independence. Nature does that. It's in the agenda of nature that we develop into independent creatures because at some point our parents will die. And so each generation needs to find its own independence. But it does so at a natural pace, consistent with its own nature. The way you actually foster independence in human children is by inviting dependence, is by meeting, because the human child is very dependent. If you meet the child's needs, we don't trust nature in the society is what it is. If you meet the child's needs for dependence and belonging and connection and attachment, that child will automatically develop a sense of independence because it's in the child's nature to do so.
Yeah.
So we don't have to push it. On the contrary, it's not that we should coddle kids and so kind of hobble them and infantilize them. You just have to meet their genuine attachment needs, give them a sense of security. They will naturally move towards independence, exploration, finding their own way in the world. So this is another thing that in our society we totally miss. And then we push our kids out. We expect them to find their way. Older societies used to have rituals for inviting children into adulthood. These rituals would exist in virtually all traditional cultures. We have lost those rituals. So we've lost a lot of the map that would guide people to be genuine human beings in our culture.
Yeah. We're talking today about mental health. And I think that public figures can play a very important role, both from a point of view of raising awareness, but also from a point of view of highlighting that we all share a common humanity, and no matter who we are, what family we were born into, we're all susceptible to the same pressures with the same consequences on our physical and our mental health. Now, Prince Harry is, I think, one of the most prominent figures, certainly in the UK, talking about mental health, arguably globally. Until recently, I would say he was very much a well-loved figure by all. But by talking about mental health, that seems to have changed. And you had the opportunity to talk to Harry that was publicized to a lot of people around the world. I'm first of all interested, from talking to someone so prominent about their mental health, about their trauma, what did you learn?
Well, having read Harry's book, Spare, which really is a depiction of a child deeply traumatized, suffering adult mental health problems as a result of that, in fact, in childhood as well, from that trauma, and being made so wrong for it all in the media. The first thing I learned is just how, well, there's a lot of things I learned by reading Harry's book and talking with the man. And by the way, I have to tell you, I really liked him.
Yeah.
Down to earth, sensitive, insightful, intelligent, well-meaning human being who really wants to make a difference in the world. So I learned about him personally. I also learned what he's up against, because in the aftermath of our conversation, I was just caught up in this gale of venom in a lot of the British press. And I was just astonished by the degree of poisonous commentary, poisonous attitudes. I just received a small portion of what he's been living with for so long now. Now, I was aware of Prince Harry's and his brother's interest in mental health issues. Back in 2017 already, they had already started a foundation to talk about mental health issues because they were traumatized kids. Their mother died, and they grew up in a family that was very dysfunctional, a loveless marriage. I mean, I could go on. This is public knowledge. And so these two young men started talking about mental health issues, and their grandmother, the Queen, at some point said, enough of this. Go back and talk about, do your royal duties and forget these personal interests in mental health. This was publicly reported in the Sunday Times back in 2017. So he's had a commitment to talk about mental health. And I saw how that's resented in modern society, because he's like the whistleblower. He's somebody who talked about his own pain, his own trauma. and the impact of that. And he also talks about healing. And so what I saw was a human being who suffered, who recognizes that he grew up in incredible privilege, but inside that royal gilded cage, he was never allowed to be himself. And he had this lifelong struggle to liberate himself from the expectations and programming that came with being a royal child, where literally was not. The message he got was, don't be yourself. He said this in so many words. So here's a man who's struggling to become himself, and how much opprobrium that attracts from a lot of people in the media and in society. So the conversation was eye-opening for me, in that here's this prince, grew up one of the most wealthiest families in Britain, never mind wealthy, also revered and historically elevated to this high status, and he suffers like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And he needs to struggle with that suffering. He needs to make sense of it. He needs to try to find himself. He needs to liberate himself. So that's what the conversation is about. And to me, it was a very refreshing, very interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. It's interesting, and maybe we'll get to this later on in this conversation, how polarizing any conversation around Prince Harry is. And it's really interesting because I don't know Prince Harry. I've seen him talk. I've seen a lot of that interview you had with him. I've seen some of his other talks. So when I say I've seen his talks, I've seen the actual conversations, not what the media are reporting about the conversation or the commentary from a prominent media expert about it. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard it with my own ears. And as someone who spent over 2 decades interacting with patients, reading them, trying to pick up the messages behind their words, trying to read their body language to really get an impression of who is this person? What is really going on here? I got to say, the only thing I get from Prince Harry is somebody who is trying his best to come to terms with his past and then move on. I get the impression this is somebody who is incredibly emotionally grounded. And I totally get the impression that this is someone who does not see himself as a victim, someone who's trying to empower himself. I mean, what's your perspective on what I've just said?
Well, that's how I perceive it as well. Now, he's a young man. He's 38 years old, 39, is he? He makes mistakes, but I'm 79 and I make mistakes, you know? And but the overall arc of his life is precisely as you've described it. And I do get the sense of a person who's very much committed to making a difference in the world. And in terms of victimhood, like I got all these, I got a lot of followers on Instagram, you know, and all these venomous notes about I'm unfollowing you because you talked to this ginger whiner, you know, and you got sucked in, you know, into it. He's not a whiner. But the British word is spelled W-H-I-N-G-E-R. How do you pronounce that? Winger or whiner or what do you say?
Yeah, whiner, whinger.
Yeah, ginger whinger they call them. Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you something. Redheaded people are more sensitive than others. That's a physiological fact. They often need more anesthesia when they have surgery, for example. This is a well-known fact.
Wow.
So the more sensitive you are, the more you experience, the more deeply you experience, the more things hurt. That's his nature. He's and he told me that all his life he felt different from others. He's just more sensitive. But he's not a victim. He doesn't perceive himself as a victim. Not in the least. That's the first question I asked him. Yeah. And in fact, when we talk about trauma, which he experienced, certainly I have, and it's my work in the world, I don't talk about trauma as a way of victimizing people, but as a way of empowering them. And in Harry's own case, as in my own case, and a lot of other people, when you understand how you've been traumatized, then you have the responsibility and the freedom to do something about it.
Yeah.
So to recognize trauma. Now you can wrap yourself in this cloak of victimhood. I was traumatized. I can't help it. This is the way I am. most people I know are not like that. Most people want to understand what happened to them as a way of empowering themselves to heal. And that's his particular trajectory as well. So he's not a victim. He doesn't see himself that way. I don't see him that way. And he is increasingly grounded. He's far happier now than he ever used to be, as he should be. And as far as his children, he's determined not to inflict on his children the kind of pain and emotional deprivation that he experienced in his childhood. And isn't that just what all parents want? Is not to make our kids hurt the way we were hurt? I mean, again, it's the universality, the ubiquitous humanity that shows up in his life experience, despite his incredibly special circumstances. Yeah. That's what's so interesting.
If you look at that story, Harry's story, from the outside, and you remove the royal family component, which of course for many people it's very hard to do, but of course as clinicians, as physicians, Gabor, we always have to treat the people who come in front of us with compassion. It doesn't matter if they're a CEO or they're addicted to drugs or they're poor or they're rich. Makes no difference to a healthcare professional. We treat them all the same. So if you look at this as a human story and you remove the royal family element, we would be celebrating this, saying, wow, what strength to confront your past, to speak up about it, to try and move on, to try and not pass on your own trauma to your children. And so why do you think that is? Why, when you put the royal family envelope around this story, why does the narrative start to change?
I think it's, first of all, people want to idealize. They want to have these fantasy bonds with figures whose lives they find glamorous and more meaningful than their own, and they don't want that illusion shattered. I think that's a part of it. But I think there's a more general cause, which doesn't have to do with royalty. So if you look at Harry's life, he's born to a young, emotionally fairly troubled woman who is in a loveless marriage, whose husband basically, Charles himself was a bullied, sensitive child, emotionally deprived. There was a story about Prince Charles, the current king, 5 years old. His mother, Queen Elizabeth, goes on a royal tour for several months. When she comes back, she greets him by shaking his hand. That's a deprivation. Ashley Montagu talked about the need to be held. When Harry's mother dies, Diana, his father comes into his room early in the morning to tell him, doesn't hug the child. Imagine telling a child that your mother just died and you don't hug the child. He spends a few minutes, touches the kid on the knee and says, it'll be okay, and leaves. And Harry's left on his own. Now, take that out of the royal context. Would you not see that as an example of tragic deprivation, emotional deprivation?
Yeah.
And so, and here's one of the funny things about the British press. I quoted Ashley Montagu, and I said that Montagu talks about the importance of cuddling and holding kids and skin-to-skin contact. And I said, even animals cuddle their kids. I mean, you tell a mother orangutan to ignore a child's emotional distress, or a mother monkey or a mother cat for that matter. I said, even animals hold their kids. The Sunday Times wrote that I said that the royal family treated like kids like animals. I said the opposite. I said they only wish they had treated them like animals, cuddled them, and they needed to be held. So that's an example of severe deprivation. Not anybody's fault. It's multi-generational in that family. So when I asked Harry, well, where does that leave you? He says it leaves me wanting to cuddle my kids and hold them all the time.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't want to pass that pain on. What is so difficult for people to understand about that? It's because people are themselves hurt and they have trouble looking at the sources of their pain. So when Harry talks about the source of his pain in his family of origin, and again, this is not a blaming conversation. We pass on our stuff. I did to my kids without meaning to. So he was in the same position. And now he wants to liberate his own children from that multi-generational transmission of essential emotional deprivation and trauma. He's vilified for it because he is speaking about what you're not supposed to talk about in the society, which is the emotional pain that suffuses so many families.
Yeah. If we take the macro and bring it right back to the micro, any individual who has become aware of some slightly toxic family dynamics, again, no blame there. You know, I will admit there's been some toxic dynamics in my own family that since I became aware and started to address them and change them, initially there was a bit of friction, but on the other side of that, it's a real beautiful, authentic connection and interaction that comes from a place of want, not a place of obligation. And I think there's a real opportunity there for all of us.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? Because you just gave me a thought. Can you imagine what an incredible gift to the world it would be? It's not going to happen. But what a gift to the world it would be if the royal family all said, yes, for all our privilege, we carry trauma. The trauma that was inflicted on a generation of men in our family, in those public schools, with their bullying and their whippings and their cruel treatment of children. The suppression of women. If you look, we as a royal family are now willing to look at our traumas. And anybody who knows the history of that family knows that in every generation, there's been one difficult relationship after another, one divorce after another, one dysfunction after another. But we recognize the multi-generational trauma, and we as a family want to heal it. And we're going to take that on as our task. And we encourage all of you in society to do the same thing. Can you imagine what a gift that would be to the world? It's not going to happen.
Why, Dr. Maté, so pessimistic? Why is it not going to happen?
Because we're all of us too attached to social role and social expectation, and we allow that to trump our inner need for authenticity. So when somebody like Harry struggles all his life to be authentically himself, and that's really what his book is all about, of a human being wanting to be themselves at all costs. A lot of people are not willing to take that on. And why not? Because people are afraid to look at their own pain. It's painful to look at our pain. It's easier to lose ourselves in our roles and in our self-images and in our worldly activities. So there's a powerful weight of historical burden that's keeping that family pretty close and not very open about their struggles. But, you know, at least Harry and his brother did at some point initiate some conversation around this, and that was a step forward.
It's so fascinating, this entire story and the way it blows up. It's interesting, because I'm not really, in general, I'm not that interested in popular media. I'm not interested in celebrity gossip. I'm not, you know, the stories that the media publish, I don't really read that stuff. I'm just not interested. But the Harry story has fascinated me incredibly, observing it from the outside. It strikes me as though a lot of people who have been through this process themselves, they've had to self-examine, maybe they've had therapy, whatever it might be, and they've recognized, you know, that very important first step, they've recognized, oh, there's an issue here. I'm living in the present based upon my past, i.e. I'm not really living in the present. I'm still living in the past. And they go through the process of changing things or trying to change things. As hard as it might be, I sort of feel that people who know what that feels like can see very clearly the Harry story with what is going on. And I feel that people who either have not been traumatized, I'm not sure how many people have not been traumatized in the modern world in which we live, But for people who maybe have been yet, as of yet at least, haven't acknowledged that or been aware of that, I think it's very easy to go, what are you talking about? This is victimhood. You know, you should be keeping your dirty laundry to yourself. That's one of the things they'll say, Gabor, won't they? They will say, okay, fine, but why do this in public? I wonder what your perspective is, having spoken to him.
Well, I think people that were not traumatized at all, and I don't meet too many of those, but they would just have natural empathy. It's the people that were traumatized but are afraid to look at it. They're the ones who react so violently, I believe, which I think is a lot of people in this society. Now, he talks about it publicly. There is a point in our conversation where people sent in questions. And the very first question that came in, and I believe you have the clip of it, is how we do remove the stigma of mental illness.
Well, let's just play that clip because, Gabor, we do have that. Let's just play that now so people can see it.
Okay. This is from Janet Joy from Brooklyn. From your experience, what do you think it will take to eliminate the stigma of mental illness? What will it take?
More conversation.
Yeah.
More and more conversation. Less of us and them.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all on the spectrum.
Yes.
And I think we slide up and down depending on what is happening in our life.
Yeah.
But I think the sooner we all accept that we're all on the spectrum, that we all have our own stuff to deal with, the labeling is not helpful.
Yeah.
It may be helpful for some people where it's like, I've been diagnosed. Now I know that. Now I know what it is.
Yeah.
But again, it goes back to this whole thing of what has happened to you rather than what is wrong with you.
Exactly.
And therefore, the more we talk about it, the more people share in your own environment, but also the more, leaders, public figures, I think the more that we can all just acknowledge this and have conversations about it.
Yeah.
And know that the people who push back or fight against it, that is probably based in their own fear.
Yeah, their own trauma.
So hopefully that answers that.
And I always say, along with what you said, is that the diagnoses are not explanations. So Harry's answer is by talking about it publicly. So by showing the commonality of it, by showing the absolute humanity of it, by sharing it, by not leaving people alone with it, to think there's something terribly wrong with them. And by telling other people that these people that are diagnosable with this, that, and the other, they're ordinary human beings whose so-called mental illnesses are normal responses to abnormal circumstances. Something happened to them to push them in that direction. So it's by talking about it. And in all my books, and you've been very open about your own stuff, and in all my books, I talk about my own dysfunctions and traumas, and to the extent that I've worked them out or haven't worked them out. And I think Harry's absolutely right. You remove the stigma by talking about it, by owning it.
Yeah.
By not making people feel isolated and deficient because they have mental health challenges.
Yeah.
So that's the answer.
I think...
And by the way, sorry, can I just make another comment here?
Please.
I have to tell you, I've been sort of silent for weeks now after this interview and watch all this nonsense. So there was a British psychiatrist, very respectable tie and respectable collar and very respectable demeanor, who did this online critique of my interview with Harry. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. I only watched a few minutes of it. One of the things he criticized me for was looking at my watch. You're not supposed to look at your watch during a therapy session. Dear sir, I want to say to him, this wasn't a therapy session. It was a conversation. The reason I looked at my watch was because people were sending in questions, and I had to make sure there was enough time in our discussion to answer the questions. So this question about how do we destigmatize, sir, psychiatrist, I was looking at my watch because I wanted to make sure that we had time to answer people's questions. Yeah. Okay, so I'm talking about the. I'm venting a little bit. I admit it, but this is the level of commentary that followed.
Gabor, you're only human, right? I cannot imagine what it must have been like to get caught up in that whirlwind. In fact, I'll be honest with you. When I spoke to you on the phone, over Zoom a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about this, I was quite saddened afterwards. You looked worn out. You looked exhausted, physically and emotionally worn out. And I remember I said to my wife afterwards, this man, Gabor is someone who's had such a huge impact on my life, my professional career, how I view the world. And to see him in his late 70s looking like that, when I know how vibrant and how energetic he is, it really did sadden me. Perhaps you could explain, you are someone who's done the work on yourself, right? So it will take a lot, I suspect, these days to trigger you. So what was it about the press, in your view, misrepresenting what had actually happened? What was it exactly that bothered you so much?
Well, you're touching on a key question. And first of all, thanks for your empathy and for noticing. I was in a troubled state afterwards. I thought I was past it. No, this really was more than I had expected. And it was also an opportunity for growth and insight and learning. Yeah. Everything that comes along in life that may be troubling or shows up as disturbing, there's a potential teaching in it. So I was in the aftermath of that interview and the feedback, this tsunami of venom that came my way. I was troubled. And I did something, do you know the book, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse?
Yeah.
Yeah, by Charlie McKeesey. A lot of beautiful wisdom in that book. And the horse is the most grounded of those four friends. And the horse is asked, what's the most courageous thing you've ever said? Remember what the horse says?
No.
He says, help. It's so hard for us to ask for help. So in the midst of that hurricane, you might say, that I was caught up in that whirlwind afterwards, and I was exactly the way you described me, I thought, well, what's going on here? I know better than this, but somehow I can't get a hold of it. So I called for help. I phoned up a friend of mine, psychiatrist Dan Siegel, who's very well known and has done beautiful work. And I said, Dan, this is bigger than me. Can you help me? And he says, what is it about this whole thing that is so upsetting for you? And I thought about it for a moment. I said, it's not being seen. I don't mind being criticized. If people disagree with me, critique me, that's just fine. But let them critique who I am and let them critique what I actually said, not their own distortions of it. And Dan said, given your early childhood, your infancy, where you were not seen as a human being, as a Jewish infant in Hungary, not being seen was life-threatening to you. And I said, yeah. That not being seen on such a massive scale, being misrepresented, triggered some very deep anxieties. As soon as he said it, I said, yeah, this makes sense now.
Yeah.
And so understanding the source of our dysfunction and our suffering is a big step towards. The Buddha said once that once you know the source of your suffering, you're on the way towards healing it.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened for me. In retrospect, I can be grateful for this whole experience because I learned something, and I came out of it, I believe, stronger and more accepting of myself. And you know what? Even with more compassion for all those critics, because I'm seeing, where does it come from?
Yeah.
It comes from their own pain, I believe.
Would you go as far as to say that pretty much all of us in Western society are addicted to something?
Well, your words about what it means to be a human being really speak to me, because addiction is the most human thing there is. And when you understand it, when you don't understand it, it looks like an aberration and an abnormality and some kind of a moral deviation. But when you understand it, it's a very human thing. So let's just define addiction as manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in and therefore craves and continues with it despite negative consequences. So the definition then involves pleasure, relief, craving in the short term, harm in the long term, inability to give it up despite the harm. Now, by that definition, of course, we're not just talking about drugs. We're talking about all manner of behaviors, from sex to pornography to gambling to eating to shopping to the internet to gaming to self-cutting to work, as probably as a physician, you know, and to any number of other activities. And my contention is that all addictions, they're not primary problems, they're not inherited diseases, they're not aberrations, they're not moral failures, they're attempts to gain pain relief, emotional pain relief for something or another. And so the first question in addiction for me is not why the addiction, but why the pain.
To make sure you're taking action after watching this video, I've created a free guide to help you build healthy habits. We can all make short-term change, but can those changes become a fundamental part of our life? Often they don't. And that's why in this free guide, I share with you the 6 crucial steps you need to take. They're really, really effective. If you want to get hold of that free guide right now, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below.
And so if we have to look at why the pain, we have to look at people's lives, their life experience, their traumas, their adversity, their suffering. And so that's why I say that. Now, when you talk to other people, what did you get from your addiction? They'll say peace of mind. They'll say connection with other people. They say sense of control. They say stress relief. They say sense of purpose. Those are all supremely human qualities. In fact, they're qualities that we all want. In fact, have every right to expect. So that's why I say there's nothing more human than addiction. Now, the problem, of course, is it creates more pain. But the impulse is simply, the addict just wants to feel like a normal human being. That's all.
Yeah. It's such a profoundly different way of looking at addiction compared to, I think, the norm in society, certainly the way many people view, you know, addicts.
Yeah.
There's a certain view, isn't there? The addict is on the street corner, is homeless, is destitute.
Yeah.
Yet we often don't want to put that mirror up and look at our own lives and go, oh, wow, you know, by your definition, by that definition, there's probably very few of us who can honestly hold our hands up and say, at some point in our life, we weren't addicted to something.
I think in this society, hardly anybody. Hence, in part, hence the title of my book, The Myth of Normal. Like, we think that so many things are normal, then there's the abnormal people who are different from us. I'm saying that that's a myth, that from the most abject and most dependent and most ill drug-addicted people that I worked with in Vancouver, Canada, to the most elevated segments of society, addictions are just rife.
Yeah.
And we're completely are blind when we choose one segment of the population to ostracize and to punish and to feel superior to. And what we're really doing is denying our own humanity when we do that.
There's all manner of different things that people can be addicted to.
Yeah.
I want to talk about one which I don't think is spoken about enough, and that's online pornography.
Yeah.
It is something that I think it's just seeping there underneath. People aren't talking about it. I remember one of my patients not that long ago, this young man, he couldn't look at me, Gabor. He couldn't look at me in the eye.
So ashamed?
So ashamed.
Yeah.
And he was just sharing with me how he was addicted to online pornography.
Yeah.
And when I asked him, has he opened up with anyone? Has he shared with anyone? No, hasn't told a single person. I was the first person he told. And what was really interesting, as I got to know him and I built up trust with him and rapport, and he knew that he could open up with me and I wasn't going to judge him or invalidate him or look down on him.
Yeah.
Actually, for this particular chap in his life, he was very isolated. He didn't have a tribe. He didn't have a community. There was no part of his life where he felt like he belonged. And for him, the ultimate solution was actually joining a boxing club. It wasn't just the physical activity, it was the tribe he got. I remember he said to me, Gabor, he said, you know, before I joined the boxing club, if someone said to me, do 10 press-ups, I wouldn't do a single one. But in a boxing gym, 10 means 10. Yeah. And my conclusion with him was simply that he was missing a tribe. He was missing community. So in the hole that left inside him, he decided to fill that hole with online pornography. Yeah. It was a symptom of the problem, which really speaks to what you just said.
Well, a number of things come up as I listen to this anecdote. One is the compassion that's required for people to open up and to actually heal. And so one of my teachers says, only when compassion is present will people allow themselves to see the truth. And so I know that one of your 3 core values that you often talk about is compassion. And that's what this man needed, to be able to open up and share and to look at himself honestly. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you study people addicted to pornography, they're not actually after the pornography. It's not about sex. It's about a temporary spike of dopamine in their brain, and dopamine being the brain chemical that makes us feel alive and vital and present and excited and curious. Now, so in other words, something happened to this man to shut down that mechanism, so he needed the extreme stimulation and titillation of pornography to get that dopamine spike so he can feel really alive. He just wanted to feel alive, that's all he wanted. Then he connects with the boxing community, and he gets himself going physically, and he gets his engagement with the group. All of a sudden, he gets his needs met in a much healthier way. So again, to criticize him and ostracize him and to shame him as he shamed himself, he just wanted to feel like a normal human being. That's all he wanted.
And that's the thing with addictions. There's a certain hierarchical kind of preference we give to them. You know, certain things are acceptable addictions, certain things are not. You know, pornography is not an acceptable addiction. Heroin is not an acceptable addiction, but it's okay to be addicted to Instagram. It's okay to be addicted to consumption and shopping.
Or power.
Or power.
Yeah.
One of the big messages I feel the new book really makes a strong case for is that we're living in a society that has at its core some values that are not conducive to good physical, mental, and emotional health.
Right.
And it takes a lot of pressure off the individual. It doesn't mean that the individual can do nothing about it, but I think it helps people realize why they're struggling so much.
Well, I know that a real core value for you is authenticity. You know, and then being oneself, being truly oneself. And I know that you've been some struggle in your own life to become yourself or to realize who you were and to let go what wasn't. And certainly that's been my pattern and struggle and commitment as well. This is a society that fundamentally demands of people that they be other than who they are. Because the demand, the expectation is that we fit into structures and workplaces and education institutions and families and social settings where if we ourselves, we risk being rejected. So that there's almost a universal demand for self-suppression, which as we both, you and I know, creates both mental and physical health problems. So that the core values of the society, which are fundamentally materialistic, individualistic, aggressive, and competitive, they go against what it really means to be a human being. And when you look at how we evolved as human beings, like if you want to study a zebra, where would you study him? If you want to understand his true nature, would you study him in the London Zoo? Or would you study him out in the savannah or wherever he or she lives? Well, you'd have to study him in the natural environment. In our natural environment, I'm talking about eons and millions and hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and even about 90% of our own existence as a species, we lived out in nature in small band hunter-gatherer groups. Yeah. Connected, engaged, belonging, connected to nature, connected to our gut feelings. We had to be, otherwise we wouldn't survive. Yeah. That's what it means to be a human being. Now, we can adapt to other environments, but that doesn't mean that we can thrive in them as well. And so that, in a sense, what I'm saying about our species, we're like zoo creatures right now. Yeah. We're living in an unnatural environment. I'm not suggesting we go back to being hunter-gatherers, but I am suggesting we realize what we've lost and how the particular social system in which we live right now demands that we stay lost.
Yeah.
That's my whole point.
Once our eyes get open to this, because as you mentioned, for much of my life, I've been blind to this. You know, I felt that success was important, being competitive was important, being a winner was important. And as I've shed a lot of these behavioral adaptations to my own childhood, I find an inner sense of peace and contentment and calm that I never had before.
Yeah.
And actually what's really interesting is as you do that, a lot of the addictive tendencies I had, they fall away.
Yeah.
Not because you're trying to.
That's right.
You're not trying to stop the addiction. This is kind of what I feel a lot of the time with, let's say something like alcohol. And as medical doctors, we say, you know, this is the limits. You know, you should drink under 14 units of alcohol a week or whatever it is, which frankly, I find a lot of public health guidance quite unhelpful. I understand the need for it. But A, it's dry. B, there's no understanding within that of what role does the alcohol play in that person's life. And I feel the classic case of something like alcohol is New Year. You know, people decide on January the 1st that this year's going to be different. I'm not going to fall into the trap I fell in before. I'm going to cut down my intake. And, you know, they do for the first week and the second week. And they're not drinking at all. But by the third week, you know, when the stress of work is still there, when the toxic relationship that they're in is still there, when the boss that doesn't value them is still there, it starts to creep in because the alcohol is playing a role, right? Serving a need. And coming back to this cultural point, you mentioned, where would you study a zebra?
Yeah.
Right? I think there's a key point here. You know, who are we as humans?
Yeah.
Many of us feel that we are competitive, right? And competition is something I think a lot about, right? As someone who used to be competitive, who is no longer competitive, really, I can put my hand on my heart and say, I'm not competitive anymore. That was a trait I developed.
That's right.
But some people say competition is natural, and I guess my view is that it comes down to the relationship you have with that competition. So can you speak a little bit to competition?
Well, first of all, I know something about your personal history, which is that, you know, being immigrants from the subcontinent here to the UK, and your parents, with all their goodwill, they put this pressure on you to excel. That if you were, I think I heard you say once that if you only got 99% of the test, your mother would say, what's wrong? How come you can get 100? You have to be the best.
Had to be the best.
Yeah. Now, they did that out of their anxiety that you succeed in this world in which you came with some disadvantage, being immigrants and maybe people of color as well, you know. But as a result, you become competitive. That's not your nature. That's just your second nature. But even in the phrase second nature, there's an implication that there's a first nature. And the first nature is you just are a human being, you want to belong. Now, competition, it depends what the intention is. If it's a competition, in the sense that you want to manifest your best, and in a sense you're competing with yourself. Not to be better than anybody else, not to beat or to dominate or to subjugate or exclude somebody else, but just because you just want to be your best. Well, that's great. The idea that we're individually competitive creatures really comes along with the rise of capitalism, which is a system based on competition where it is dog eat dog, and where the bigger fish do swallow the smaller ones. And as we can see this happening right now with the tremendous rise of inequality in the last decades, you know, 8 people in the world now control as much wealth as the bottom 50% of humanity. Now, the interesting thing about human nature is that when people do something selfish or aggressive or competitive, what do we say? Well, that's just human nature. But when people do something selfless and generous and kind, nobody says, oh, that's just human nature. So there's an assumption in this culture. And what we do is we take the core values of a particular materialistic culture and we project them onto human beings as if that was our true nature. It isn't. And to the extent that we try to conform to it, we create suffering for ourselves. and for others. Now, competition as between Liverpool and Manchester City, in this capitalist world, even that gets pretty vicious, not in the sense of the players being vicious, but in the sense of how can we get the best players in the world and who can pay the most money for the best striker, and where will Haaland go? Will he go to Manchester City or Arsenal? Even on that level, what is meant to be play, we talk about playing football, but it's no longer play. It becomes a business of dominating others. So whereas it could be just play, and in play, there's no consequences to who wins and who doesn't.
Yeah.
It's just for the process. It's just for the enjoyment. It's just for the sheer pleasure of the activity. The human beings are meant to play. There's a circuit in our brain that's designated to play. Play is essential for human development, for human child development, for the brain development. But even in the play, we've made into a competitive, cutthroat endeavor.
Yeah.
That's how far denatured we've become.
I don't know if you are familiar with Johnny Wilkinson, probably one of the world's, certainly one of England's most famous rugby players ever. When Johnny was a little boy, he wrote down his dreams on a piece of paper. He said, I want to play for England. I want to win the World Cup. Now, the problem for Johnny is that by the age of 24, he'd achieved his dreams. Right? So, yes, he plays for England, and then he helps England win the World Cup in the most fairy tale situation. He kicks the winning goal in the final minute of the World Cup final. Wow. The sort of thing that kids all over the world now would dream about doing. He did it at the age of 24. The problem is that he said, as the ball left his boot, even before it had gone through the goals, he's starting to go down.
I get it.
In his mind. The following morning, this is after they won the World Cup, first time in years, national hero, he can't get out of bed. Lonely, depressed. I find his story incredibly fascinating because he ticked the boxes of what society says you need to do to be happy and successful, yet it left him with this inner turmoil. And he said something to me, Gabor. He said many things, but one thing in particular I remember is he said, I used to play rugby for the joy of the game.
Is to play.
At some point, it changed from being joyful and playful to being something that said something about who I was.
Yeah.
And he thought winning would say something about him. And his relationship to rugby changed.
Yeah. It's an incredibly powerful story, and it illustrates a point that I've often made, is that there's two common ways to wake up. One of them is to fail, but an even more dramatic way is to succeed. Because then you realize that you've got what you wanted and it's empty. Yeah. Because it's all been external. And so in a certain sense, people who are succeeding, they're fortunate because as long as you're failing, you might keep thinking, if only I succeeded, I'd be happy. But the people who succeed, and then they realize they have a much more rapid opportunity to wake up because now I've got what I wanted. And it's nothing.
That's still the whole
side. I mean, you and I both know this. I mean, we both have been successful physicians, and as a child, or as if your parent could have pictured your future, or my future, famous and physician and successful and all this kind of stuff. But we both know how empty it is in itself. Yeah. Now, it doesn't need to be. If it's fulfilling, if it expresses who we are, if it's aligned, as you say, if we're in alignment, then it's great. But it's precisely when we succeed that we find out, was this in alignment or was it not? And often it isn't.
I guess there's that wider point there, which is success, right? What is that definition of success?
Yeah.
Because if we talk about the toxic culture in which we live, many of us around the world live.
Yeah.
Actually, by its metrics of success, society is successful, making a load of money, people consuming lots of different things, new fashion every 3 months, people buying clothes they don't need, endlessly consuming things that they don't want. Even, I was thinking the other day about sustainability and the environment, and even the word sustainable and then sustainable products. I was thinking, the elephant in the room here is that we sure, there's a value to sustainable products, but if we're still over-consuming sustainable products, it's not that sustainable.
Mm-hmm. And what it ignores is that, like, if everybody in what we call the third world, or what we euphemistically call the developing world, consumed at the same level as we do in this world, it would take several Earths to support the population. So even the so-called sustainability is only sustainability so far as it's restricted to a fairly small proportion of the Earth's population. And so that in a global sense, there's nothing sustainable about it whatsoever.
People often hear this, Gabor. They hear you speaking or me speaking or whoever saying, these things don't make us happy.
Yeah.
Jim Carrey, I think, was once quoted as saying, I wish everyone would become rich and famous so they could realize it doesn't make you happy. Uh-huh. But the common view from people is, yes, it's okay for you, Jim, to say that. You've had all that success. Gabor, it's okay for you. You've got all these successful books. Millions of people around the world watch your talks. It's okay for you. Or the same thing to me, right? So I guess the question is, how do we help people see this without having to go to that extreme first? Is it possible?
Well, and those people who point that out to us, they're making a valid statement,
I agree.
It is easy for you and I to do this at this point. All I can say to people is you have to find out for yourself. When do you feel good about yourself? When you're straining for something external, or when you're aligned with yourself? When you have got other people's approval, even on a limited basis. I mean, not everybody's going to be famous, not everybody's going to be, in the public eye, but everybody has a certain circle of belonging, a certain circle of engagement. When in that world you get approbation from others, but you're denying yourself, how do you feel? When you are being yourself, even if others don't approve, how do you feel? When I say how do you feel, what's happening in your body? And most people, most of the time, if they paid close attention, they'd realize that when they're being authentic is when they feel really good about themselves. Even if it means, and let's face it, but to be fair to you and I, we didn't exactly make it because we tried to fit in. No. We made it because we, at some point, decided that we're just going to speak our truth.
Yeah.
And especially as physicians, you don't immediately get a lot of brownie points for pointing out the shallowness and just limited worldview and actually harmful binary division of mind and body. You don't get a lot of accolades within the profession for pointing these things out. So it's not like I didn't set out for success. Honest to God, I didn't. I wanted it. I'm not denying it, and I had a lot of ego investment in whatever I did. But fundamentally, that wasn't what was driving me or calling me. What was calling me is once that you start seeing certain things, you just want to speak them. And it was that desire to speak my truth that led to whatever success I've had. Yeah. And I would guess that something similar is true for you as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what's so powerful about that is that these things can coexist, right? Yeah. You can be speaking your truth. You can feel compelled to write a book that the world needs, but you need to write.
That's right.
And also like the success that comes with it. Yeah. Right? It's not either or. It's not either it's completely selfless. Maybe there is a selfish component to these things as well, at least at the start.
At the start, yes.
At least at the start. That's certainly been my experience. I felt compelled to speak the truth as I saw it, the frustrations I had within medicine that for so many patients, I think we're underserving them with our reductionist, simplistic biomedical model without taking into consideration all the other aspects that drive health. Yeah. But yes, it was, my son nearly dying when he was 6 months old that...
Oh, gosh.
Really drove me to completely change my worldview on what is important. I had to speak up. I felt I had no choice but to speak up.
That's right.
And yes, over the last years, I've had a high degree of success, whether it's with this podcast or my books, for sure. But over the last 2 or 3 years, I've really gone deep, Gabor. Your work's helped me hugely with that, for sure. But also the work of, Dick Schwartz and IFS.
Yeah, I know.
internal family systems has been transformative for me in terms of making peace with various parts of myself. And now, honestly, I sit here before you like a different person to when I first met you 3 or 4 years ago. Like I feel when I met you last time face to face, I feel I had multiple holes in my soul. And, you know, we had a great conversation that people enjoyed for sure, but I feel I sit alongside you today complete and whole. And I've never felt this deep sense of contentment and happiness.
Well, I'm so happy for you. When you talk about holes, there's a teacher of mine that I quote often, A.H. Almas, and he says that we're born with these innate essential qualities. As the world doesn't recognize them or discourages them, we shut them off and we develop holes instead. Then we spend all our lives trying to fill these holes until we realize that so as soon as, you know, like self-love or, you know, self-acceptance or clarity or courage or love for others or sense of belonging or sense of unity, as these get shut down, develop these holes instead, then this whole society is so expert at selling us stuff to fill those holes temporarily, but only temporarily, so you have to getting more and more and more. And the whole society lives on trying to fill people's holes that can never be filled from the outside. This is the whole ethic of this culture. In terms of writing the book, I was sharing with you before, and in writing this one, it really wasn't, okay, I'm going to write this book and become even more famous. Honest to God, because I suffered writing this book. I mean, I'm not saying this self-pityingly, I'm just telling you what happened. 10 years, I collected 25,000 articles of newspaper reports, scientific papers, medical journals, and so on. A couple hundred books, 300 interviews, and then 3 years of writing, like every day. And at times I sat there, I had nothing to say. I didn't know, there's nothing was coming out of, flowing from the tips of my fingers. And I thought, I can't do this. I talked to Russell Brand once, and Russell said, remember something, you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing this for the world. And that really helped. Get over your own ego. Just do what you need to do. And at some point, I actually weekly talked to a therapist for a couple of months. I was so despondent about this feeling that I had. There's so much I want to say, and then what I want to say is, at least I think, is so important. And I'm not finding the way to get it out of me. So that wasn't done for my pleasure, believe me. That was really done because there's something in me that just wanted to be said.
You know, that's so powerful, Gabor, because I think for people to hear that, that you, this esteemed, globally respected physician, when writing this latest book, and you've written many fantastic books already, right? That you are getting consumed with self-doubt and insecurity about, you know, have I got anything worthwhile?
My blood pressure, which is usually that of a baby's, was going up.
Yeah.
I was getting concerned. Would I have to go on blood pressure? No, of course, I didn't have to go on medication. But it was just finally somebody said to me, a very wise therapist, she said, your problem is not the book. Your problem is your relationship to the book. And just that rugby player that you mentioned, I'd allow myself to be totally identified with the book.
Yeah.
So my success or my validation as a human being depended on how well this book was doing. Well, actually, what's the reality? Let's see if I had written a lousy book and nobody wanted it, and it's not the end of the world. It doesn't change who I am. It just means that for once I didn't succeed, you know? But it's the identification that had me so anxious.
As we have this conversation, you are maybe 2 months out from publication.
3.
It's okay, 3 months. Okay, but this is going to come out when the book's out.
Yeah.
A lot of us, we know the right things to say. You know, we've studied this. We know what we should value, yet we still can't help falling into traps. These traps that I think society lays out for us. At this stage in your life, you've heard me say that I think your new book is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I genuinely mean it from the bottom of my heart. Let's say the book comes out and it's not as successful as I think it's going to be, as maybe you think it's going to be, or maybe your publishers think it's going to be.
Or as I think it should be.
Or right? Yeah. What is, as honestly as you can, what would you say is your relationship with that now? If this book tanks when it comes out, what does that say about you?
You know something? That's something I've engaged with over time. Now, whether I'm fooling myself or whether I'm being authentic here, what comes out of me is, you know what? This is the book I wanted to write. Yeah. After all that struggle and all that, this book, it's a long book, but it was double as long when I first finished writing it. My son and I, who helped me write it. And we had to cut it and trim it and rewrite it and rewrite it. But now, you know what? This is the book I had envisioned 10 years ago when it first occurred to me. So you know what? Now it's out in the world, not up to me anymore. But I'm satisfied that I said what I needed to say now. Talk to me 4 months from now. If the book tanks, how will I be feeling? Probably pretty lousy in some ways. But it's not going to fundamentally affect who I am. And it's not going to really affect my core happiness, my core sense of what my life is about, my sense of myself. It is not going to affect that. Yeah. It's going to be okay regardless.
I believe you. I honestly believe you. I happen to think it will be a big international bestseller.
Yeah. From your mouth to God's ears, as they say.
I think it's a must-read book for everyone. But if I may, I'm going to share my own experience with that, which, again, you know, the Rongan of even 5 years ago would have felt too shy and insecure about sharing, right? You've touched on some of my childhood story. I know you've read my latest book. You've heard a lot about how I saw myself when I grew up, which was very much, I felt loved and validated when I had high levels of success. It's nobody's fault. My parents did the best that they could. They wanted the best for me. Yeah. But little Rongan took on this very, very toxic idea that has led to a very lonely place inside me for much of my life. Yeah. Now, like you, I'm someone who has ticked a lot of these societal boxes of success. Yeah. You know, this is millions listen to this podcast each week. A lot of people buy my books. They've all been Sunday Times bestsellers, right? Yeah. Now, what was interesting is my latest book, Happy Mind, Happy Life, came out, 2.5 months ago in the UK. Yeah. And you can't write a book like this without doing a lot of self-reflection on yourself. And I remember the week or two before it came out, I was just chatting with people close to me. I was thinking about it. And I genuinely thought, like you've said, Gabor, this book is the best that I can do at this moment in time. It's exactly what I want it to be. I've really tried to distill a lot of complex ideas down, make it really simple, very readable, very practical, which was my goal when writing it. How this book does in the world is no reflection of who I am as a human being. Yeah. If nobody buys this book, it is still a great book. I'm still incredibly proud of it, and it says nothing about who I am. Now, I was pretty convinced that I honestly believed that, but as you've hinted to, we're pretty good as humans at kidding ourselves as well.
Yeah.
Now, here's the reality. The book comes out.
It's a success.
It's the most successful of any book I've ever published. Yeah. And about a week after it came out, I got a text from my senior editor saying, "Hey, Ron, can you give me a call, please?" I thought, this is weird. I never get texts like this. So I said, sure. So I called her and she goes, "Hey, Ron, we just found out this Sunday you're going to be the #1 Sunday Times paperback bestseller in the country. Wow. Congratulations." Yeah. Now, the point of me sharing this, and this is where my insecurities come for sharing something like this, will people think I'm being arrogant? Will they think I'm boasting? I promise from all my heart and soul, this is not the purpose of sharing this. The purpose of sharing this is, in that moment, Gabor, I didn't feel this artificial ego elevation. Yeah. I really didn't. Yeah. I was just quietly content. I could hear her excitement and the team's excitement in the background. Yeah. I didn't feel it. I know for a fact that 5 years ago, I would have been jumping through the ceiling. Yeah. I would have phoned all my friends. But honestly, I thought, okay, this is awesome. My message is going to get out there to more people. Fantastic. But my wife said, I still need to wash my daughter's sports clothing before school tomorrow. Yeah. Still need to cook the kids' dinner. Yeah. And for me, it was a real life test where I thought, you're saying the right things. Yeah. You think this is happening. Now, in the actual reality, now, look, what would have happened had the book tanked? I don't know, because that didn't happen. But for me, that was a really powerful real life scenario where I thought, hey, buddy, maybe you have actually healed these holes inside yourself, because actually you didn't feel it. You didn't feel it like you used to.
Well, it's wonderful. You mentioned your wife when you were talking. It made me think of my wife, because she has never wanted my success. She wanted me, the real person. And so she, as much as she appreciates the success and celebrates it, if I get too caught up in it, if I start identifying myself with it, I have somebody to come home to who will knock me off my pedestal pretty quickly, which is great, and my relationship with Ray is woven throughout the book, because it shows up in so many areas of parenting and male-female relationships, and why women get chronic illnesses more than men do, and so that we've sort of lived the whole thing. And I have to say, left on my own, my head would be a whole lot bigger than it is. But thanks to, no, of course, I give myself credit. I chose that relationship, and I chose to stay in it. I'd rather have the truth than whatever simulacrum of truth I could sort of project and blow a balloon like out there in the world. But it's essential, because and I came to success rather late in life. I mean, you're a young whippersnapper compared to me, but here I'm 78, and I can handle it now.
Yeah.
I honest to God, 10 years ago, it would have blown me away.
If you found that helpful, I think you are really going to enjoy this video, where I outline the common signs that you may be on the road to burnout and what you can do today to change it. One of the worst things in life is when you've got no energy. Every day feels like you're on a treadmill. I've been a medical doctor now for over 21 years, and this is one of the commonest complaints I see